Void corporeal, part-time college professor, full-time loser. Given what's happening in Rafah and some of the events we've seen last week, I just wanted to sort of like create more of an open chatting space for us to possibly talk about some of that as we see the way the world is unfolding. So sort of trying to think of a topic for the stream, I just sort of settled on something simple. Is the world getting worse? I have probably specific thoughts on that, and I'd be willing to sort of share them. But, you know, unfortunately, I think my answer to that kind of is yes, it is. And how far that goes and how long that goes, I think are more of the complicated questions that are more uncertain. But in the short term, I think some level of pessimism is pretty justified. And like I said, I just wanted to make space for that because we're all in it together. One thing that I've noticed, particularly around the issues pertaining to Gaza and the freedom of the Palestinian people, is what seems to be a worse than usual sort of growing attempt to manufacture consent around the idea that opposing the war is inherently anti-Semitic. And I think there's a lot of problems with that, but two really stand out. One is that there's an equation of settler colonialism to Judaism, which I think is really, really problematic. So what's really interesting about that construction is that it relies on and assumes a consensus that anti-Semitism is a bad thing, right? So for that to be something you can manufacture consent on, you have to have a pre-existing cultural consensus, or at least a majority sort of viewpoint, that to be anti-Semitic is a bad thing. And the existence of a kind of broad cultural agreement that's implicit that anti-Semitism is not okay is obviously a huge development and a major anti-racist victory, particularly considering the 20th century and all that it held for the Jewish people. But in this conflation of Judaism and not only settler colonialism, but the particularly egregious form of it or iteration of it, particularly during the Benjamin Netanyahu regime, where all signals, oftentimes barely veiled, sometimes not veiled at all, point to an explicit goal of removing the Palestinian people wholesale from their own land and erasing the idea that there was ever such thing as a Palestinian at all. So what we see when these things are combined is we see a weaponization of victories of anti-racist work, which has produced a society in which it's possible to use the accusation of anti-Semitism as a marker of something unacceptable, and having that victory weaponized to enable racist assaults against the Palestinians. So that's the first problem with the increasing conflation of anti-Semitism and opposition to the military and political aims of the Israeli state in regards to the Palestinian people. The second issue with that conflation is the erasure of the fact that a substantial portion of the leadership of the pro-Palestinian movement in any given location in the United States is often Jewish people, Jewish students or members of the community who are Jewish. And so what we see is another weird type of racist work going on through the media and through attempts to sort of pressure and frame within the media a kind of transplanting of an idea of what is happening in Palestine to the United States. And that idea is that in Palestine and Israel, what you're seeing is a conflict between Jews and Muslims or Palestinians. And if you're familiar at all with Israeli politics, one of the problems with that is that a majority of Israelis historically support something like a two-state solution and oppose the current military operation in Gaza. So to reduce it to Jews versus Palestinians is a racist erasure. We see that sort of framework, that simplification, transplanted to the United States. So the fact that a substantial portion of the anti-war effort in the United States is Jewish-led or is participated in substantially by Jewish people, often including Israeli Jews who are in the United States, not only empirically gets the facts wrong and misrepresents a richer understanding of what's happening to the extent the news is reported to the American people, but again facilitates this kind of racial characterization that hides the true racial implications of the issue. Because the true racial implications of the issue are not a sort of simplified story of, quote, Palestinian protesters versus sort of, quote, Jewish counter-protesters. And whose side are you on? But the true racial stakes of the issue are U.S. complicitness, the complicity of the United States in an ongoing settler colonial project to dispossess an indigenous people from their own land through extreme brutality, constant violation of the Geneva Conventions. So much so, the Netanyahu administration has said, well, the Geneva Conventions don't apply because Palestine isn't a recognized state. They're technically Israeli because the Palestinian territories exist as kind of open-air prisons or reservations within Israel by Israel's design. And the Netanyahu administration's argument is because that's what they are, instead of an actual state, the rules of war don't apply. Because instead of fighting another people, because the Netanyahu administration's interpretation of the Geneva Convention is that's when you fight another state. Because that's not what they are. It means they can do whatever they want because it's kind of their own people. And so it becomes a question of their own sovereignty. So the racial stakes of the issue are United States support of this ongoing process and project, right? A military operation that knowingly bombs hospitals, that tells civilians these are your exit routes if you want to leave the combat zone, and then bombs the exit routes and bombs the caravans of people leaving. In what's clearly a kind of gaslighting that's designed to intimidate and further create a deeper sense of insecurity amongst the people, and also just to eliminate their bodies, because that makes it easier to claim the territory. State who has looked at Palestinian territory and agreed, for example, with the Trump administration, created an agreement that maps out the substantial reduction of current Palestinian territory through sort of exactly saying where they'd like to put new settlements, so that Palestinian territory is eventually reduced smaller and smaller till it's less than half of what it currently is. And obviously, with the Netanyahu administration, the goal would be to reduce it down to nothing eventually. So when I say one of the reasons why I think it's important to make space, one of the reasons that I think it's important to sort of talk about whether the world's getting worse is we're not going to see, I think, an end anytime soon to the efforts to construct and manufacture consent in precisely these ways to enable this type of violence. And another thing it signifies is just how deeply we already live in a world in which political actors, the media, and major sectors of industry like arms manufacturing industry are implicated in protecting one another's interests. And to the extent that that is mediated at all, right, and we aren't just sort of fed explicitly sort of classic old school fascist propaganda, it's purely because these sets of interests are limited by the general skepticism of the American people. In other words, they can only get away with so much so fast. Nonetheless, the effort and the goals are fairly clear. So in addition to those two primary sort of implications in the struggle for an anti-racist world, there's also the exposure of the complicity and entanglement of the media industry and politics, which isn't, of course, a new story. I mean, even again, Dwight Eisenhower warned about that, a Republican president in the 1950s, because it had already happened. But it seems to me that the tactics and practices of persuading a public are in some ways more effective, and to the extent they aren't effective, they're starting to learn how to adapt. I want to be clear that a positive sign is that the majority of American people don't currently support the war, or polling suggests that the views of the American public have been shifting. At least there's actually a lot of different data out there, and some of the data suggests that the majority of the American people, a slight majority, still support the war, and some polling suggests that a slight majority oppose the war. But the trajectory is fairly clear. The public opinion has been shifting against the war in Gaza. So we have the two sort of primary problems of the ways in which the current cultural political configuration of the United States undermines victories in anti-racist work that are fairly important and critical achievements in the 20th century. We have the exposure, for those looking at it, of the ironclad, inseparable linkages between political actors, so specifically politicians, public officials, sectors of industry like weapons manufacture, and the media, who, by the way, you know, virtually every media outlet is owned by a conglomerate that also has direct interests in persecuting the war against the people of Palestine, direct financial interests. Because we live in a country, if you're in the United States, where a small handful of major corporate umbrella entities own most of the televised and print media, the vast majority of it, as part of those umbrellas, with sort of weapons investments or aerospace over here on the side too. That's troubling. Then, as a third sort of rational reason for pessimism or alarming development, we have the fact that those same interests are trying to manufacture consent around suppression of protest, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, by performing a kind of interesting and troubling gymnastics around prioritization of public interest. So in addition to the misrepresentation of protests as anti-Semitic, or the misleading racialization of those protests and portraying them as Palestinians versus Jews, there is the equation of the public's right or ability to influence public policy and public officials through sustained protests, activity, organizing, distribution of literature, media attention, with things like whether or not a building has graffiti on it, or whether or not grass in a public area is not being able to be watered or get enough sunlight. I think patently, if you in any way have a sense of democratic politics, and I don't mean the Democratic Party, but a sense of authority being derived from the will of the people, and that one of the trade-offs that the elite have to accept when they create a system in which they rule, the people do not have an opportunity to directly make policy. We simply are given a chance to weigh in on whether we like our current rulers. Essentially, we choose our rulers, right? And that every few years we can decide we like someone else more. And one of the trade-offs is the self-organization of the people to influence elite decision-making. The equation of that with like whether or not there's some individual went to a building and spray painted like 3 words on it with the right of the people to do these things is insulting. It's insulting, it's damaging, it's troubling and horrific. And it's particularly troubling and horrific considering how much of the impetus to suppress dissent and organizing comes from the Democratic Party, while they, and party officials, elected politicians, while they are simultaneously out of one side of their mouth talking about how much they love and respect freedom of speech and protest, and on the other side of their mouth saying, but graffiti, but the grass. Which seems like, to me, when these same Democratic Party officials also go on television the next day or the next hour, or they're being interviewed on a 24-hour news station, and the next topic is the growing anti-authoritarian, or the growing authoritarianism of American culture, the way in which voters are leaning towards favoring strong men rather than sort of classically elected presidents, right? The quote decline of American or Republican or Democratic values, right? That they are complicit in this. And in many ways we could talk about, but in real time right now, like simultaneously, because these are politicians that in 1 minute while talking will excoriate the youth for seeming to not value democracy or democratic principles, excoriate people who are caught up in being frustrated with declining standards of living in the United States, and gravitate towards figures who promise that they will just come in, seize control, and put in places things that will help them, right? Outside of democratic processes. That while they do that, on the other hand, they equate people who are already exercising, the group of the population that are exercising precisely their assertion that it is not the elite who ought to be making decisions, but it ought to be the people exercising their agency, and putting politicians in a position where politicians respond to the will of the people rather than vice versa. Sort of a clear juxtaposition of a democratic sensibility versus an authoritarian sensibility. While the Democratic Party bemoans the yearning, the leaning of a growing part of the American population towards these things, at the same time, the Democratic Party equates the exercise of rights to whether or not grass is being trampled, whether or not one individual is so outraged or feels so strongly that on a building nearby a protest they put graffiti up. And so we're supposed to, according to them, hold in our hearts a firm belief in the right of the people to control the destiny of the state above all else, and against any sort of authoritarian leaning, except that misdemeanor vandalism is even more important to put an end to. And when that occurs, it's okay to send in armed thugs in black uniforms with multiple weapons and give them orders to clear people out using extreme physical force, potentially ruin the lives of all of those people in multiple ways, through their sustaining of severe injuries, through possible legal charges that will stick with them forever because someone over here did graffiti. And these people possess such a democratic sensibility that they are not willing to be removed from a space and not willing to give up their belief that it is incumbent upon them to use their First Amendment rights to influence public policy. And again, to sort of summarize what I'm saying, while the Democratic Party is bemoaning Trumpism and the cultural shift that leads to Trumpism, this is yet another way in which the Democratic Party of the United States is enabling that shift. Yeah, Cobalt, I mean, it's so patently insulting and sort of terrifying to see petty vandalism take a greater priority than questions of death, destruction, and people's role in deciding the extent to which the state will be involved in those things. Like, there's a period in the Soviet Union, I mean, with the what you're talking about, Cobalt, with the quite elderly leadership choices that seem very obviously in like cognitive decline. It was like another old timer who like had been waiting in line, right? And so when one died, they like just slotted the other old timer so he could have his brief moment of being the leader before he died. I mean, even the rhetoric of the parties, particularly in the Democratic Party, flex that exact same sensibility since Obama, right? Very often saw Democratic Party talking heads for both Hillary and Biden in the lead up as part of their campaign, sort of saying, well, they waited their turn, it's their time, they've been so involved for so long, as like an actual argument for why they should be in charge. Didn't help the Soviet Union. It was a major contributor to their decline. By the time they got Gorbachev in there, who started to adopt policies that could have kept the Soviet Union alive, whether or not you like the Soviet Union, the point is it was too late. But what's worse is that this process is being conducted in a way that makes it seem like it's what we want. Like a majority of the American people neither want Trump nor Biden. And yet, those are the choices. And yeah, Taki, I mean, I think I couldn't tell you how much more I agree with your sarcasm there. Yeah. As long as you're completely perfect and make no trouble. Exactly. Well, and that's the other thing too, because even if there is no trouble, they'll just make things up about you, right? So I do want to just say this, not to sound like conceited or egotistical, but really because I'm broadcasting a recording and talking about some of the things is sort of dangerous. And one of the sort of weird light protections around these topics is whether you're talking about some of them for educational purposes. So I don't intend to sort of have to preamble this, you know, in general in the stream. But I do want to preamble this, that this is me speaking as an educator, person with an advanced degree who's specialized in some of these questions. But the question of violence and nonviolence in a protest is problematic in a lot of ways, and the way it sort of works out in the United States. Because, and I'm going to sort of highlight two things. And the second thing is more relevant to what you're saying, Taki. The first is that the demand for nonviolence in practice often equates to the idea that people don't have the right to defend themselves when attacked. And so this is something that the civil rights movement did not intend, but it's an effect that the media and the political apparatus has sort of managed to produce in the wake of the civil rights movement. I don't think it was the civil rights movement's intent whatsoever to say that if you want to protest something, you have to be willing to be mauled by a dog. And that should be the rules of politics. I think they thought it was atrocious that they were mauled by dogs or that they had to be beaten up by police officers and they couldn't fight back. And they very specifically trained themselves not to punch back because they were aware, in their case, primarily operating in the southern United States during Jim Crow, that the moment they punched back, it would, in those states and in a generalized racist culture, people were racist enough to think that a black man being beaten, possibly to death, that punches someone back, then at the point of punching someone back now deserves to be killed. And so they specifically trained themselves not to punch back as a matter of self-protection. It was not at all their intent to, again, establish this norm that the cost of political protest is you literally have to be willing to die, be shot in the face with a rubber bullet, take batons and not grab the baton and pull it out of someone's hand so you can't be beaten. And yet we have the promotion of this expectation in the media that that's precisely the cost of doing business when you're a protester. And you are a good protester if you allow yourself to be harmed, and you are a bad protester if you defend yourself. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, even if you are nonviolent, they will just lie about you. They will make up things. Even if you are a perfect protester, they will just report on a rumor that, you know, off to the side, someone was violent or someone said something mean. And we've seen that particularly in the UCLA crackdown, where most media outlets unproblematically reported things that were empirically not true, like people couldn't get access to buildings, people were being attacked by the protesters off to the side, which there's no footage of. And there were cameras going constantly everywhere. In fact, there were a lot of cameras the whole time being placed on the protests by the anti-protesters. And then, to the extent that something happens, the actions of like one person become a reason to remove the rights of hundreds or thousands of people. So even when you are a perfect protester, they will just say you were violent anyways. And this actually happened to the civil rights movement. Like, King went on the news constantly to talk about how they were nonviolent and they promoted nonviolence, but the police would go on the news and say they in fact were violent and they were just responding to violence. And fortunately, a majority of the American people actually didn't believe King even at the time, because the civil rights movement was not supported by a majority of the American people. The majority of the American people actually thought it was extremist, radical, and violent, because the news would report that it was, even though it wasn't. Yeah. Well, so, and also Cobalt, let's like examine just the Soviet question a little bit. I mean, I brought it up and you're responding to it, but let's say that Reagan did bring down the wall. Let's just say that the right-wing fantasy about, you know, Superman Reagan is correct. That means Reagan's responsible for the disintegration of one of the largest, most populous, most advanced societies of the 20th century. A society literally capable of competing with the United States in the space race. I'm going to sort of point out some of the things the Soviet Union doesn't get credit for in the United States. It took a population of largely peasants still living under feudalism in the 20th century, and even in the second decade of the 20th century, it is still a feudal society. While the rest of Europe is industrializing, Russia looks like, except for sort of the emergence of some factories and some of the major cities, Russia largely looks like the rest of Europe looked in 1915. Russia looks like it's 1715. And in less than 100 years, the Soviet Union establishes a modern industrialized civilization. It increases literacy, it increases health outcomes, it increases education. it develops itself into an entity capable of existing the most technologically advanced military at the time, which is the German military under Adolf Hitler. And I'm not here to say the Soviet Union is some wonderful thing. And the version of communism that the Soviet Union developed was a terrible mutation of the work of Marx and Engels, achieving indirectly, in many ways, the opposite effects that Marx and Engels intended, and using institutional designs that Marx and Engels wouldn't have supported in the name of Marxist communism. It had walls of separation. It tried to limit and control the cultural development of its people. It engaged in agricultural practices that led to mass death. So the Soviet Union wasn't all roses either. In fact, you cannot take it away from it. It competed in the space race. World War II was won because the Soviet Union and the United States made an alliance. Like, you see the pictures of FDR and Stalin and Churchill. Britain was essentially defeated already in the war. They just had yet to be invaded, right? And to the extent that they mattered for the rest of the war, it's because of the intervention of the United States and the Soviet Union and the coordination between those two countries, right? That allowed the British Army to continue operations and not have to pull its people back. I think there's a pretty strong case to be made that the most important achievement of human civilization, of all of us as a species, of the 20th century, is the defeat of the fascist states in World War II. That in response to the development of a more liberalized, globalized economy that was moving in the direction of sort of either reforming itself under emergent communist practices or further developing under capitalism, in sort of the tracks of that comes this political mutation called fascism, right? That seeks to undermine human freedom, because capitalism and communism at base are different notions of freedom. So both privilege some idea of freedom and sort of posit that freedom is the most important goal of a politics and is the purpose of the state. We simply have competing understandings of what freedom is. The fact that the human race arrives in the 20th century with the dominant political logic for an ever-growing part of the world being a dispute about what freedom is, that's premised on the idea that we already accept the assumption that freedom is the most important thing, is pretty significant. It's pretty significant, especially for European societies who, even in the beginning of the 20th century, the Dark Ages are not so long ago. The Enlightenment and the scientific revolution still took place largely under authoritarian monarchies. For most of Europe, it's not until the mid-1800s and then in the middle 20th century, you have this emergence of fascism. Yeah, I think there's some truth to that, Cobalt. But of course fascism emerges as a counter politics to the sort of dual conceptions of freedom. At base, what fascism sort of says is that the most important value, the modus operandi of politics, isn't freedom, it's vitality. So you can see this in sort of Jordan Peterson's work, who is a fascist, whether he says so or not. So under fascism, the most important thing is vitality, and from their sort of fascist vitality politics, the way in which you produce vitality is through micro-contestation and macro-contestation. So you need an extreme hierarchy for people to sort of struggle under, right? So you have to obey your boss, but you also want to betray your boss to take their job. Your deeper human potentials are brought out through competition and conflict and war, right? And the way in which a fascist vitality politics emerges and is constructed, it is very explicitly freedom makes vitality impossible. Freedom is a kind of draining of human potential. It's a stagnation. And as I said, the most important event of the 20th century, the greatest achievement that the human race was able to accomplish in the mid-20th century was defeating. That's more important than the moon landing. Stalin's an interesting case in that, right? Because Stalin isn't a fascist, but he is an authoritarian, and he is a totalitarian. And some of these distinctions are subtle, but they're actually sort of important in the broader story. Oh, I have this here. I bought this today, thinking that Dream might come in, because we were talking about like cupcakes the other day, and like which cupcake you would have if like you could have any cupcake. I went to the store today and I saw that they had exactly what I described. They had a chocolate cupcake with vanilla buttercream icing. So I've just had this here in case Dream shows up, because in the Discord, Dream was even posting a picture of that cupcake, that type of cupcake. So I wanted to show. So I'm waiting to eat it in case Dream shows up, to symbolically eat it with Dream. But if Dream doesn't show up, maybe I'll eat it anyways. Let me just go back to Ronald Reagan and fascism. Let's assume the story about Reagan was right. Should we really admire someone who brought an entire society to its knees, particularly a society with some fairly important contributions to the progress of the 20th century? And even if Reagan is Pokey, yay! I'm being clipped. I'm a real boy. I'm a real boy. I'm a real streamer. I'm not made of wood anymore. I'm a real boy now. Yay! Particularly considering what Russia has become, right? Russia being precisely a proto-fascist demonstration about how unrestricted capitalism leads to a kind of neo-feudalism, an authoritarian neo-feudalism controlled by monopolies overseen by a dictator. I think the celebration of Reagan as the anti-Soviet champion or whatever should look a lot different to people in 2024 than it did in 1994, because we see what has happened. One of the things that bothers me is, sure, okay, you're conservative or whatever in 1994 or 1989, and that seemed like a really good thing. But do you have the intellectual integrity since then, and in 2024 reassess that? Is that really something to celebrate? Again, let's just assume that the mythology of Reagan, the anti-Soviet warrior, is correct and we give him all the credit. Is that really an accomplishment? Are we better off? Is Russia better off? Are the Russian people better off? The answer should be transparently no. The answer now in 2024 should be, that was a bad thing that happened. The United States helping to bring the Soviet Union to its needs made the world worse. Moon was one of the first people to come in here and really give a lot of encouragement, which really mattered, because when you start doing it, it's very easy to get insecure about what you're doing. And once we become $1 billion brand, we won't forget that Moon was right there at the foundation of it. When we're living our big content creator lifestyle and in a streamer house with the other $1 billion streamers. Yeah. Gorbachev wasn't he wasn't so bad. Let me just, I don't want to get too meta, like you come into a stream and they're talking about streaming. It's like, what's the point? But it's hard not to talk about it because it's still very new, and it's very much at the forefront of my mind and my feelings that we're starting to build a little community here, and I'm just so incredibly grateful. I keep going back between talking about Dream Daddy and cupcakes and the declining nature of civilization and the development of further racist oppression. There's a microprocess, particularly in things like this, that are well covered by the media, where admin and the police will try and construct legitimacy around the suppression of the protests. And one of the sort of basic ways in which you do that is you sort of draw the story out for a couple days, and make clear that the people have been given warning, so that the next day or the next day, it will potentially feel like to the viewer that, well, they asked for this, they were warned, and it went on and on. So my sense is most likely what's the police coming in. Yeah, the last count I saw is that there's encampments, or have been encampments, because the list included Columbia and UCLA, whose encampments were whose protests were suppressed. But in the current moment, over 130 colleges have not just had protests, but specifically had encampments. We'll see how that shapes up. That's amazing. I don't know if I mentioned it on the stream the other night, but prior to streaming what was going on at UCLA, I had gone down to the encampment for a while, which is why I could verify again that, like, actually no access to buildings were being blocked. There was a point in which you couldn't get into those buildings actually at UCLA, and I only mention this because one of the constant things that the media keeps misreporting at the behest of administration, which just shows that what's really at stake with administration is they did not like the protest content, which was against them, because they're knowingly lying, was this line that the building access to the buildings were being blocked, and the building access was not being blocked at all. The only point at which the building access was being blocked was there's sort of 2 points, and neither of them have anything to do with what the protesters were doing. The first point is that on the day that Gene Block was going to send in the police, he canceled classes. So it was Gene Block saying, actually, you can't get an education now because of my decision making. And the second point of limited building access was, at a certain point, the police shut down the buildings because they were putting snipers on the roof, and they didn't want students running around down below that. But at no point did the protesters block access to any buildings. They were just in a plaza that's often used for events, including, I mentioned this the other night, but I want to just make this clear for any other viewer that wasn't here. When the admin has big multi-day events, oftentimes with tents set up and music and loud disruptive things, they use that exact same plaza, and sometimes the multi-day events are exclusive events that cordon off the area, and students are not allowed to enter there because it's for, like, bigwigs and university donors and invitees, right? It's not for students. But when admin's doing it for their purposes, it's okay. When students are doing it, it's not okay. So hard not to just go off on a tangent in multiple directions. Again, one of the things that I find super troubling is just this idea that there's, like, a time limit on freedom of speech or assembly. You have freedom of speech, but you have a weekly quota of the amount of hours you can engage in it. You have freedom of assembly, but there's a weekly quota of how long you can assemble or something. That the very people that are being criticized by the protests are allowed to determine. Because in the case of UCLA, they were criticizing UC policy. And then the UC admin said, well, time's up on that. You've criticized us enough. But we do live in a world where the cost of exercising your rights is being willing to be assaulted for it. You were here when we were watching the aerial footage and the main force of police came at UCLA and sort of distracted everyone, right? At the entrance to the encampment. And then, you know, we were even saying on stream, now get ready for the flanking maneuver, right? And then it was like, what, 3 or 4 minutes later that other group came and started dismantling the barricades. And by the time the protesters got over there in enough numbers to potentially fight it back, it was too late. They'd already taken down enough of the barricades that at that point it was inevitable. The police have drones, they have the command center, they're using radio communication, they're playing an RTS against the American people. And it's troubling. As I said, I think US political discourse has really mutated nonviolent protest in a way that is very hostile to protesters. But what that means practically, if you're a protester, is that even if you defend yourself, right? If you defend yourself in any way, it sort of authorizes extreme violence against you. Because there is this policing consensus that if you're protesting, it means you're willing to have anything done to your body by the state. And that if you don't accept that, and you do something as small as just grab the baton that's coming down on your head to stop it from hitting you. That then possibly authorizes you to be shot. So it's one of the things you have to develop your own relationship to. Admin doesn't say they're not going to tolerate something and then tolerate it. Generally, they do have this Nixonian thing of not wanting to look weak in general. Yep, it's not just the question of the police on this issue, it's also the question of violent counter-protesters coming in and attacking you. And that is a whole other ball game. And if that happens, yeah, absolutely defend yourself. Because as we learned from UCLA, just because police are present doesn't mean they're going to stop you from being potentially beaten to death or having potentially lethal weapons used against you. Fortunately, when the police decide to attack you, a whole different set of logics snap into place, right? You have to make a lot harder choices. Come on, Fossabot. Don't expose me like that. By the way, what's with your outdated insults? This isn't like 1981. You just said I'm not a real punk. Where did you even learn that? You're lying, Fossabot. That is not your origin. Get out of here. It's just another reminder again. I mean, while he's criticizing the Democratic Party about its complicity and developing the same authoritarian sensibility that they critique with Trumpism, particularly around the issue of Palestine. See, but it does remind me that one of the potential presidents of the United States is someone who, in the wake of Heather Heyer being murdered by white supremacists in North Carolina, described the Nazis, the American Nazis and skinheads, as mostly good people. And that's not a disqualifier, apparently. Apparently, a significant portion of the American people, around 30% or so, are fine with somebody who thinks that a majority of American Nazis are fine people becoming president. So while the Democratic Party is complicit in the growth of authoritarian dynamic and is certainly adding fuel to the fire in how they're approaching Palestine and in the generalized racism that they promote on the question of Palestine, the thing that they're enabling isn't abstract. It's right over here off to the side, and his name is Donald Trump. Many things apparently aren't enough to disqualify. That's why I said earlier in the stream, I don't know if you're here for it, and I didn't sort of go into it in detail, but at this point, a significant portion of the American population clearly has a yearning for authoritarianism. They yearn for the boot. And I think in many ways it's developed into kind of a death cult mentality. So it's not particularly a Trump cult, it's actually maybe more appropriately a death cult. And Trump is just sort of the container for a sort of death cult dynamic that's developed. Because I think very specifically for a lot of those people, even their hatreds are containers for a more basic impulse. Donald Trump tacitly authorized the assassination of Mike Pence. But Mike Pence wants to be liked by the Trump supporters, so he would only go so far in criticizing Trump. What a loser. I don't admire Pence at all the way that other people do. Pence isn't just some, comical Christian figure that won't be in a room with like a woman without his wife present or something. Pence was brought into the Trump administration for a very specific reason. In addition to the fact of trying to shore up the evangelical vote, Pence helped mastermind the corporate claiming of real estate, specifically in New Orleans for Hurricane Katrina. So Pence's political specialization is in helping wealthy real estate interests claim property. Pence was on the commission that came up with the gentrification plans. It's a little bit of a crude description, but it's accurate enough. After Hurricane Katrina, and you had the displacement of the working class black population on what's essentially prime real estate in a major city close to the coast. And you had the government displace those people, quote, temporarily to other states like Texas. Pence was in the background as part of the broader Republican effort to seize that land that the people were no longer sort of living on, and redevelop it to the benefit again of wealthier real estate interests. So I tend to think that that probably has more to do with why Trump liked Pence than Pence's Christianity or whatever. But yeah, what a loser. Trump tacitly authorizes Pence's assassination and Pence does nothing. But in terms of the United States death cult, which again, I think Trump is just a container for a death cult impulse that pre-exists. Even the targets of that death cult, trans gay people, immigrants, Muslims, liberals, and also college professors. I don't know if you remember this, but Trump made a blanket statement in the middle of his administration that sort of sounded like college professors were intrinsically treasonous or traitorous, certainly a suspect group of people. You know, there's someone in the middle 20th century that sort of had a very similar list of sort of very identical targets, right? All of these targets, I think at base, actually don't matter to most members of the death cult. I think what they have is fundamentally an interest or a longing to see violence and understand that politics is animated by death. I think the death cult impulse is driven by a fundamental sense of disempowerment that the US political economy has sort of engendered in people since the late 1970s, where we see the beginnings of a decline of quality of life in the United States and a growing sort of inability for the population to have meaningful political impacts. And I think there's a complex political psychology in which that fundamental sense of disempowerment turns into resentment. And that resentment turns into a revenge impulse. And as that revenge impulse is allowed to fester decade after decade, resentment often turns into an impulse to see and witness and experience violence. And so I think the targets in many ways are just sort of the convenient locations to place your desire to watch people be beaten or killed or understand that they're jailed, right? And it feeds into very perverse forms of social solidarity, because one of the things that happens with declining standards of living is it deepens feelings of alienation. So people feel increasingly alienated. And when you combine that with resentment, what you get is a kind of dark solidarity. You find a solidarity with other people who share that resentment so that you can feel part of something in bearing witness and encouraging and finding glee in the destruction of the other. It's just these are the containers they can get away with putting their desire to watch the boot fall on something, on someone, to be able to turn on the news and watch police in military gear beating or shooting people, right? The death cult impulse is simply something that Trump is sort of capitalizing on. Trump didn't develop it. He didn't originate it. He's not the cause. He's simply the container. In some ways, he is trying to direct it and utilize it for his benefit. But let me just take a moment to talk more shit on Mike Pence. Pence gets all this credit for his heroics, you know, because like he said no to like joining a fascist coup. I feel like that's a really low bar, that Pence actually should get zero credit for that. Talk about a sign of the decline of the American population into a basic authoritarian positionality. Because even liberals and Democrats were giving him credit as if this was an amazing thing. The assumption is, of course you would participate in a fascist coup, and it takes an exceptional hero to say no to it. What an incredible soul. The Democratic Party is certainly the party that is most responsible for authorizing the conditions which lead to fascism. The Republican Party is the party that has decided to contain that growing force within American society. And let me be more direct. The Republican Party is a fascist party, flat out, straight up. Fortunately, we're in a situation where the two choices are a party which will promote policies that will strengthen the pulse towards fascism within the American political zeitgeist. That's option one. And option two is that fascist zeitgeist. So that's where we're at. And one of the things caught in the maw of political hell is the fate of the people of Palestine. And currently, one thing that the fascists can agree on with the alleged anti-fascists of the Democratic Party is the Palestinian people essentially deserve what's happening to them. No matter how many times Biden or someone else says they want more peace and they think Israel's gone too far and, you know, it's not good to kill civilians and all that kind of stuff, the United States is still giving weapons and money over to Israel while this is happening. It's literally the equivalent of watching someone stand on the street and shoot a gun into a crowd and standing next to that person and saying, I don't think it's good to shoot people randomly in a crowd, while handing them another magazine of ammunition to reload their gun. You really shouldn't be doing this. Here's some more ammunition. There could be nothing more hollow and insulting than the Democratic Party positioning itself as, in some ways, desiring the restraint of Israel, while agreeing with the Republican Party that Israel should continue to receive military funding, or really funding of any kind. Because Israel is so dependent on US aid that if the United States decided that, as a growing portion of the American people have already decided, that American funds shouldn't be used to facilitate a genocide, it would be very hard to carry out that genocide, or impossible, possibly. So the United States could decide, you know what, we're not in the genocide business anymore. But instead, we're in a situation where the US political elite say, oh geez, we really don't think civilians should be killed on a large scale, while they give the person doing the murdering more ammunition to do it. It reminds me of what King and Malcolm X said about the white moderate. If you've ever read King's letter from Birmingham jail, King makes a pretty strong statement about white moderates, about people trying to sort of play to both sides. And what King says very directly is that that is worse for justice than being a member of the Ku Klux Klan. So King's analysis was that sort of moderating position does more to prolong injustice, violence, unfreedom of people than people actively promoting a white supremacist politics directly. It is hard for people to know what to do. We have to be honest with ourselves too. We, the people who are concerned with trying to develop greater political agency, we are in a tough position in terms of how we would make a change or what we would do. And one of the reasons we're in a tough position is, while the United States purports to be a democracy, by design it's a republic actually. And so people's ability to directly control political decision making is almost non-existent. We don't make rules or rule ourselves as we would in a democracy, where things like what the people think and what the people want would directly translate into political outcomes. In the United States, of course, we choose our rulers. We don't rule ourselves, we simply choose who will rule us. And most people live in situations where that choice is actually predetermined based on gerrymandering, where essentially legislators choose their own districts, so they draw the electoral maps to guarantee a party victory for themselves. So they live in uncompetitive districts. And then beyond the question of Congress, this is something I think I want to keep talking about and developing more of an analysis around. Someone who's 24 years old, who maybe is coming into their political agency, maybe who is at these protests, maybe who's a right-winger. If you're 24 years old, you have lived 12 of those years, half your life, in a country where the ruler of that country was rejected at the ballot box by a majority of voters. And I think I think it's very hard for people to know what is possible even to do or make a change other than complain in the structural confines of a country that actually, in fact, does not give you choice, but purports to be the freest place on earth. Again, I mean, it's a meme. We're free to choose from, 50 different toothpaste flavors, all made at the same one factory, but put in a different boxes or whatever. So really, we get to choose between the color of toothpaste boxes. I think Gen Z has obviously shown a lot of... I think that's one of the effects of living in a context where it's clear. I think for like millennials, Gen X, and even for the old boomers who were part of, the counterculture and the various movements of the 60s and 70s, I think we were sort of burdened with a set of illusions. Maybe millennials less so, because millennials came of age in the Clinton 90s when the welfare state was being actively gutted by the, pro-labor, pro-welfare party, and they were the main perpetrators of eliminating social services. And then when millennials are entering the job market, right, we have the decline of the US economy. Nonetheless, the prior generations are burdened by a kind of illusion or mythology that we have more influence or importance and power within formal political mechanisms. And so if you go to protests or you watch events unfold, I think for everyone older than Gen Z, there's this constant sense of kind of shock, like how could this happen here? But Gen Z, their earliest childhood memories take place within the context of the Patriot Act and a surveillance state. And then, their kids and the financial crisis happens, and they're living under presidents who weren't elected by a majority of the people. And they're already in a position where their understanding of the earth, the basic health of the earth, is at the point where scientists are saying, like, it's already too late. Like, we maybe have 5 years, but it doesn't look like we're going to make the changes we're going to need to make to save the global ecology. And so they don't have a lot of illusions. They, in a lot of ways, don't have the burden of a mythology that older generations have. They see things a lot more clearly. And they understand that to the extent they're unhappy, they have to get out in the streets. Which is why during BLM, you saw tens of thousands of people all over the country in every major city out on the streets, sort of shutting large segments of most major cities down. And the vast majority of those people were Gen Z. So yeah, I totally agree with you. The younger generation seems to take a lot less shit. Yeah, and they understand that Rock the Vote was a scam, right? Okay, so white supremacists just murdered a woman in North Carolina, and the president seems to be in favor of it. So what we got to do is wait for 2 years and tell all of our friends that in 2 years we're going to vote for someone else. And in the meantime, we just eat shit and take it. But in 2 years, we'll show them at the ballot box. They already understand that the elections are illegitimate. They already understand that even if you get a lot of people to vote, and even if you get a majority of the people to vote for someone else, it might not matter because the majority doesn't rule. So they're more prone to take matters into their own hands, which is one of the more positive things to come out of it. And it's something we see around the question of Palestine. This is Gen Z driven. People of all age groups participating. There are millennials and Gen Xers and baby boomers supporting down in the encampments, in the marches, speaking to the media, writing, streaming about it. I am as a 40-year-old millennial. But the bulk of it is Gen Z, as you were saying, because they've been developed under material conditions that make clear that it's only through direct action that you even have a chance of substantive change. They weren't burdened with the illusions that you could make a change through conventional political measures. Again, half their life has been under presidents who were, if you're 24-year-old Gen Z person, literally 12 years of your life was presidents who became president even though the majority of people rejected them at the ballot box. So they don't tend to think, again, the method for change is to wait for 2 years to vote, to try and vote again. okay, what's going on right now is really horrible, but we'll get them in 2 years. You know, they're out there. It's okay, it falls to us. Now we see that at over 130 campuses, where not only are there protests, but encampments. A significant portion of Gen Z is very, you can see it in internet culture, and also, I mean, millennials like me are definitely part of that and development of that internet culture, which is very nihilistic. And I'm in favor of that. That's not a critique. Like, I think nihilism is very rational. But, you know, another sort of thing in Gen Z is it's not all heroic direct action. Like, another obvious response to growing up in a context of the Patriot Act, presidents who lost the popular vote, collapsing US economy after the financial crisis, all this stuff, right, is not the sense that change is up to people engaging in direct action in the streets, which, by the way, that's what it's always been. It's just that prior generations are burdened or given the illusion that there's some other way where you don't have to do that stuff. Hey Dream, how's it going? We're talking about fascism, by the way, and also admiring Gen Z. But I wanted to show you something. I've been waiting. So I went to the store today and they had a chocolate cake with vanilla buttercream. And I have been waiting to eat it when you're here so I could eat it with you, since you put that delicious picture in Discord. But as I was saying, I'll eat the cupcake in a second. But as I was saying, even though that's how change has always been made, is through disruptive action in the streets, prior generations have lived under material conditions that have allowed for the illusion that maybe we could do it some other way. But Gen Z, it's not possible for Gen Z to be sort of told rock the vote, because half their lives have lived in a country where a majority of people rejected a president and they became president anyways. They lived under the financial crisis. They watched people as at a young age, right, in formative years, lose their homes because banks defrauded the government and broke the law, manipulated the stock market to produce a financial crisis so they could profit off the crash. And then they watched none of those people get prosecuted. And they saw, like 9 or 10 years old, news footage of people being kicked out of their homes, and then would hear, like, again, I'm not saying a 9 or 10-year-old understands economic issues, but they do understand basic things. They also live in the world. If that didn't happen to them directly, they probably knew people who did. Their little friend, Timmy or whatever, doesn't live in the country anymore. They lost their home and now they had to move to another state or something. So they live through all this. They just see what it is. All they've grown up in is what it actually is. So they don't have this sort of thing that millennials or people that are older have of like, how could this happen here? What's going on? You know, it's just like, yep, that's what it is. So that's why we've got to be out in the streets. But let's also look at Rafah updates. Let's see what NBC is saying about the Rafah attack.
The only language Hamas understands is force. And all day, Israel shelled the southern city of Rafah. Israeli tanks...
Wow, what an opening for the clip. Holy shit. That's what the journalist says? This is the journalist? He doesn't say, quote, Benjamin Netanyahu or something? That's the story that the journalist is presenting? The only language Hamas understands is force. That's why Rafah is being bombed. I guess the people of Rafah are just all Hamas. Unbelievable.
Rumbled in, trampling over Palestinian signs, taking over a border crossing with Egypt. It says Hamas uses for terrorist purposes, but also stopping the flow of aid. The White House says the operation is limited, not Israel's long-anticipated major offensive, which President Biden opposes because the city is packed with more than 1 million civilians ordered by Israel to come here for their safety. Israel's defense minister says the operation is designed to pressure Hamas to free its hostages, but that Israel is also prepared to make concessions to bring them back. As we're learning more about Hamas's counteroffer, claiming it will free all hostages in stages in exchange for releasing Palestinian prisoners of Hamas's choosing and a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Israel says the proposal doesn't meet its security needs. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu dispatched a negotiating team to Cairo to discuss the proposal.
Well, even before we get into the proposal, I just want to, like, I know it's sort of obvious and like flogging a dead horse at this point, but I don't think we should ever stop flogging it. Saying the operation is designed to pressure Hamas is, again, like part and parcel of the violations of the Geneva Convention. This is the logic within the statement made by the official. Hamas has killed Israelis, so we're going to kill Palestinians, and that'll show Hamas. You're not allowed to use people as pawns that way. And certainly if the criticism of Hamas is that they do that, then when you do it, aren't you also a terrorist?
Today, he sounded dismissive, calling the offer an attempt to sabotage the Rafah operation, which he said is vital to destroying Hamas. In Rafah today, our crew filmed at one of the only remaining hospitals where
Netanyahu is so like directly out of Orwell. Why are we attacking Rafah? Well, we want the release of the hostages. Well, Hamas has offered to release the hostages. Their release of hostages is simply an attempt to sabotage the operation against Rafah. Look at the circular reasoning there. Netanyahu couldn't make it more clear that his goal is to clear out Rafah, and this is a pretext. He wants the Palestinians they're offering to release the hostages, but that's just because they want to stop the war. I don't want to laugh at it. Like, I apologize. I realize that's sort of inappropriate, but sometimes the logic is so insulting, and yeah, gaslighting, as you're saying, that it's hard not to laugh at the absurdity of it.
Mohammed Abu Amra cries for his 9 sisters, brothers, and niece, all killed in an Israeli strike today. He's racked with guilt. He invited them to stay in his home because it's further away from Israel's new positions. Then he says, for reasons he doesn't understand, Israel bombed his house. No one is left, he cries. It's just me, and the rest are here.
The CIA director is in Cairo, along with negotiators from Israel and Hamas. The Israeli military says it will intensify its operations in Rafah unless there's a deal. Lester?
Netanyahu said that they're going to reject a deal because the whole purpose of a deal is to stop the operation. So he's not interested in a deal. The reporter starts with, force is the only language they understand. And then Netanyahu says this batshit stuff that undermines himself, this self-undermining, contradictory, gaslighting position. And that just passes without commentary. But I think in order to seem fair and balanced, or in order to help manufacture the consent for the genocide, they make sure to show some clips of some civilians, which sort of just obscures or helps. It makes the voice of the reporter seem more legitimate. So when the reporter says that and points out that civilians are dying, it makes it easier to sort of swallow the other things that the reporter is clearly communicating, which is that this is all necessary. It's just tragically so. Yeah, Huck Finn, I mean, it's basically that right now, except the control isn't quite complete, but it is an open-air prison. That's just what it currently is and has been for a long time. Certainly, the goal of Netanyahu is not even to achieve that. That's largely been achieved, in my opinion. And I'm curious whether you disagree or what your thoughts are. But Netanyahu's goal is the clearing of Gaza. You know, he even has understanding that he came to, in particular with the Trump administration, was the establishment of even more settlements. Netanyahu and his officials over the years have made clear in veiled language and sometimes very explicit language that they don't think Palestine exists, they don't think Palestinians exist, and they don't want them there. And their goal is to slowly shrink it. So coming an open-air prison under further control is more just like a stage and a process that is designed to eradicate the existence of Palestinians on that land. And clearly Netanyahu doesn't really care how that eradication takes place. They leave or they get killed. Either way, the most important thing for Netanyahu is that they're gone. Netanyahu regime it's sort of like established what their settlement goals are. So if you look at maps of their settlement goals, like what they were trying to achieve and what they were directly trying to get U.S. buy-in for during the Trump administration was like a reduction of Palestinian territory over time so that it's less than half of what it currently is. Even though settlements have been ruled illegal, one of the beautiful things about making an ally with the U.S. is the U.S. is on the UN Security Council, and Security Council members can veto. So if you have a Security Council ally who's willing to veto UN action against what you're doing, then you can kind of do whatever you want. And the Netanyahu administration has made really clear that their goal is to dramatically reduce Palestinian territory and just seize it, like colonize it further, settle on it. This is not at all to dispute what you're saying, but to sort of reinforce your point. Over the years, you have numerous statements. It's sort of like one of their talking points that there's no such thing as a Palestinian. And that statement itself is very much in line with the definition of what a genocide even is. So even the UN understanding of genocide, academic understanding of genocide, if you study genocide, genocide is not only the murder of a people, it is the murder of the identity of a people, so that they no longer have a culture as a people or a bond of solidarity as a people. It's the destruction of the identity of a people. And what the Netanyahu regime and its administration have done clearly fits into that sort of understanding of genocide, as they constantly, as a talking point, reinforce that they don't believe that Palestinians exist. There's no such thing as a Palestinian. And that sort of pre-configures, it makes clear what their goal is. They're trying to create a world where everyone agrees with that. Whether these people live or die, they're not Palestinians. There's no such thing as that. It's Orwellian, and it's depraved. The clearest parallel from the U.S. context is the indigenous people of North America, the Native Americans. Because if, for example, the United States hadn't murdered the Native Americans, but it had alternatively simply put them into the reservations without mass death, without over 90% reduction of their population, and simply done the thing, purely sort of forcing people to not speak their language, forcing them to convert to Christianity, forcing them into these re-education centers, these so-called Indian schools, which the United States did, and Canada also did. If all they had done was that, remove the language, not allow them to practice their traditional means of subsistence, right? Force them to integrate in the U.S. political economy, force them to convert religiously. If they solely did that without killing one person, that would still meet the definition of genocide that is included in the concept of genocide. I don't think enough people understand that. Genocide includes not just killing the people, but killing a people. So even if all the bodies of the Sioux were still living and breathing, by not allowing them to be the Sioux anymore, or the Cherokee, even if everyone who was born to Cherokee parents and is genetically Cherokee or Apache or Sioux, even if all of those people lived and none of them died, it's still a genocide because you're eliminating what it means to be Sioux or Cherokee. The Sioux and the Cherokee no longer would exist. That's a genocide as well. Though, of course, usually the two things go together. It's actually not one or the other. And that's certainly the case in Palestine, where it's both. So you have the attempt to erase the identity of what it is to be a Palestinian, and you have these attempts to eradicate them physically. Huck, I don't know if you were in here when we watched the clip, but there was a moment in the clip where one Israeli official was saying that the purpose of attacking Rafah was to pressure Hamas to make a peace deal. And then it cuts to the journalist saying that Hamas has offered a peace deal. And then it cuts to Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, saying Hamas is only offering a peace deal to stop the military operation in Rafah. And what that reveals very clearly is that Benjamin Netanyahu's goal isn't a peace deal. It's to attack Rafah and to kill a bunch of people and displace them. Because a very predictable thing happens when you start bombing a major city. People leave. They don't just die, they also leave in large numbers. And Rafah was designated by Israel as a safe zone, and it's close to the border. So now that Netanyahu's corralled people who are fleeing bombing in other areas into Rafah right up against the border, he's going to bomb Rafah now too. Literally described a peace deal as Hamas's attempt to stop the bombings, after saying the point of the bombings was to pressure people into making a peace deal. So it couldn't be more transparent that his point is the bombings. What he wants to do is bomb. He wants to push everyone to the border and then bomb them in the border, and then maybe they'll leave. Fossabot, don't get, that's a little too real. You're going to hurt my feelings. I'm about to turn 40. Like, I'm not denying you're right, Fossabot, but, you know, maybe as an AI, you should learn some manners. Unbelievable. Look at this bot. That's not where you come from, Fossabot. Stop lying to the chatters. You have like 7 different origin stories you put out here. They're all ridiculous. No one believes one of them. And Cobalt was sort of pointing out that Gen Z, I'll sort of editorialize a little bit, Gen Z gets a lot of shit, you know, for whatever, like being on their phones or whatever. But we are really seeing the push from Gen Z in a kind of more real practical understanding that political influence happens at the street level when you don't have money or privilege or power. And people our age, we've seen a lot of things. One thing that we've both seen at our age is we've seen pre and post 9/11 United States. We've seen a version of the United States that was much more prosperous in the 80s, or in the 90s in particular. Just to finish the point before the ad cut us off. They're born into a post 9/11 world, but one of the things I was sort of mentioning about that is they don't have any trappings from the prior world. This is the only one they know. They know a world where 2 of the 4 presidents that they've lived under were rejected by a majority of the American people and became president nonetheless. World they know is the post-financial collapse world of post-2008. They know the Patriot Act surveillance world. They know the world where most congressional districts are gerrymandered. And because they don't have the trappings of a sort of prior fantasy of the United States in the way that people our age, frankly, do, things are more clear to them. So they don't sort of get bogged down. Oh, well, you know, this is going on. I guess I should wait 2 years to vote in the next election while it just continues to go on for years and years. They understand that, and this is the way it always worked. This is the way it worked with, you know, the 8-hour day. It's the way it worked with child labor. It's the way it worked with labor rights, civil rights. They understand that if you don't have very much power, you have to do things at the street level through disruption. And so we've seen, you know, how much of this is being driven by this generation who I think most clearly understands that there's really no other option than this. But yes, and that's another thing we were talking about too, Huck. I think you're exactly right. I mean, the other side of that coin, right, which is why while a lot of Gen Z have a kind of clarity, it's this or nothing. Many of them feel like it's nothing. While we've seen like protest movements really swelled by how many members of Gen Z understand that you need to go out in the streets. That's also sort of matched by a huge portion of Gen Z that don't even think that will matter either. So there is no voting, there is no protesting, it's a rigged game, it's all over. There's nothing left to try, and the future will get worse. So anyways, let's watch this Piers Morgan clip.
It's been a dramatic 24 hours in Israel's war on Hamas. First, Israel said it was finally preparing to enter Rafah, the southern Gazan city, which has become a refuge to 1.5 million Palestinians.
He still is. And he hasn't been
fearing catastrophic civilian impact. But Israel says that Rafah...
He hasn't been great on this issue either. He's done some other interviews where, I don't know, put it this way, I think what Piers Morgan does is he chases sexy conflict. And so He reads the zeitgeist and he interjects himself as a devil's advocate because that's a pretty good formula for getting viewers. And so sometimes that means Piers has good content, because one of the things a lot of journalists don't do anymore is they don't skeptically respond to what spokespeople from a position say. So Piers, in his method, sometimes accidentally becomes a good journalist, because many journalists are so hungry to maintain good relations to spokespeople and officials that they don't challenge them, because that could lead to them losing access to them. But at least Piers, you know, in his business model, it sort of requires him to be skeptical. And I'm really interested to see him apply that. I really don't want to give him credit.
Rafah is also the refuge for the remaining Hamas battalions.
We just thought, isn't it sad if we're in a position where we've got to rely on Piers Morgan for like skeptical journalism?
Last night, Hamas announced it had accepted the terms of a ceasefire proposed by intermediaries, but Israel rejected it. And overnight, it seized Rafah's crossing with Egypt, a key entry point for vital humanitarian aid, and began attacking the east of the city. In a moment, I'll talk to Avi Martin and Mosab Hasan, Youssef. But first, from Jerusalem is Israeli government spokesman Avi Hyman. Mr. Hyman, thank you very much indeed for joining me. Why did Israel reject this apparent offer of a peace deal from Hamas that they'd agreed to?
Hi, Piers. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm not sure what Israel has rejected. I know that Hamas put out a statement that they had accepted some kind of a proposal. It's somewhat unclear to us what proposal they accepted. This was obviously, as my Prime Minister said in the last hour, a way of trying to torpedo our entry into Rafah. And as you said, the last 4 battalions of Hamas.
I just want to reinforce, we just watched another clip, and this is the line that the Israeli state is having on the attack on Rafah. We watched an Israeli minister say that the point of the attack on Rafah is to pressure Hamas into offering a peace deal for hostage exchange. And then Hamas offered the peace deal and hostage exchange. And again, Israel said that the purpose of the attack on Rafah was to achieve that. And then when Hamas did it, Israel is saying, well, they're only doing it to stop the attack on Rafah. So it's very circular. We need to attack Rafah to get a peace proposal. Well, they only offered a peace proposal to stop the attack on Rafah. So what gets revealed very clearly is the point is to attack Rafah, regardless of a peace deal. If they don't offer a peace deal, they're going to attack Rafah. And if a peace deal is offered, well, that's only because they don't want us to attack Rafah. So it's predetermined. Rafah is going to be attacked. This is a city where Israel informed the civilians of Palestine, go to Rafah. This is a safe zone. And once they've corralled people there, they're going to bomb it regardless of what Hamas does. They're just going to bomb it. And they think you're stupid. They think everyone in the world is stupid. They think like we don't have a memory that lasts 4 seconds. It's insulting. This is called gaslighting. It's what abusers do. This is a group of people that is murdering civilians, and they think we're stupid. They think they can say the point is to create a peace deal, and then we don't have a memory that's 2 seconds long. And the next thing that comes out of their mouth is, well, they're only offering a peace deal so we don't attack them. That's insulting.
Are in Rafah. Our war aims remain the same: to destroy Hamas, bring home the hostages, and ensure that Gaza doesn't pose a threat to us. As the Prime Minister has said, with or without a deal, we're going to need to go into Rafah. So we entered Rafah. We're keeping the pressure up, the military pressure on Hamas. That's what worked last time when we got about half of the hostages released. And that's what we're doing now. We will keep up the pressure and explore all of the diplomatic channels. But at the moment, Hamas's position is far, far away from ours, sadly.
How many civilians in Rafah, of the 1.5 million people there, is Israel prepared to view as collateral damage to eliminate the remaining Hamas terrorists?
Piers, as you know, the IDF does our absolute utmost to avoid civilian casualties. Just in the first day of the operation, we've taken 100,000 citizens, civilians from Rafah out of Rafah.
Well, that leaves 1.4 million.
Okay, and it's a work in progress. So I
Well,
can
my
tell
question,
you that
my question is that you're trying to eliminate Hamas completely, but in the process, already you've pretty much destroyed most of northern Gaza. You've already killed up to 40,000 people, depending on whether you accept the Hamas-run health authority numbers. Obviously, a number of those people are Hamas, and a large number are innocent civilians, women and children. And if you go into someone like Rafah, which has 1.5 million people who've been told to go there by Israel, who've been displaced from their homes, which have been destroyed in the main, and gone to this refugee camp, how many could die before Israel says we can't continue this operation?
Piers, we're fighting against Hamas, a genocidal terror organization. I've seen your coverage, your tremendous coverage of what Hamas did to us on October 7th. You and I know they want to do it again and again and again. That's their words, not mine. Now, we'll do what we have to do to go after Hamas, to avoid civilian casualties, something that we have successfully done. Out of that Hamas number that you just gave, more than 14,000 are terrorists that we took out. There's more than 25,000 Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists taken off.
How many civilians do you believe you've killed?
We don't have exact figures, as you know, it's the fog of war.
But you've got exact numbers for Hamas terrorists you've killed. Why wouldn't you know how many civilians you've killed?
Because obviously our focus is to go after the Hamas terrorists. And
hang on, I mean, that does imply that you're putting a bigger premium on killing Hamas terrorists in terms of numbers and accountability than you are on innocent civilians. That can't be right, surely. If you know exactly how many Hamas terrorists you've killed, you must know how many civilians you've killed. Otherwise, you're prioritizing the lives of terrorists over innocent people.
Piers, with respect, don't put words into my mouth, please. I didn't say exactly 14,000. I said around 14,000. Whereas Hamas will come out with precise numbers that statisticians will look at.
Give me a ballpark number for civilians.
Well, you can use the ballpark as far as the Hamas figures, which I reject as being false.
Well, if they're false, why would you give me those?
I gave you the numbers that I had.
No, you've told me you know how many Hamas terrorists you've killed, but you don't seem to have any idea how many civilians you've killed. I'm just bemused. Why wouldn't you keep count of both?
I don't have that information to give you, Piers. If I did, I would.
You literally no idea how many civilians you've been killing.
I can tell you definitively that our aim is to go after Hamas.
No,
We've done it successfully.
I'm sorry to push you on this. That's quite extraordinary. You're an official spokesman for the Israeli government, and you have no idea how many civilians you've killed. I thought you just told me that you were particularly careful about not killing civilians. But if you don't know how many you've killed, how can you say that with any certainty?
Because even if you were to go by a ratio of the Hamas figures, we would still be far ahead of any Western army.
It wasn't my question. You know it wasn't my question.
I don't have the information.
Well, you literally have no idea how many civilians you've killed.
It's not that I don't know. I'm not authorized to give the information. I don't have the information.
That's complete nonsense. Why are you authorized to give me the number of terrorists you've killed, but not the number of civilians? I don't understand. Can you explain?
He's just like a deer in the headlights. I'm not here to do anything except justify genocide, okay? We don't talk about that. We don't mention that. Haven't you seen our ministers saying that Palestinians don't even exist? So how could we have a figure about a non-existent number of deaths of non-existent people? Wow. Incredible.
Piers, we will go after Hamas. We will ensure that we
you want me to believe you're being incredibly careful about how many civilians you're killing, and you have an amazing exemplary record, but you don't know how many civilians you're killing. So how do I know you've been careful?
Piers, when the dust settles, we will come out with the proper numbers. Hamas runs to the press daily with false...
When the dust settles, a lot of people will have died, and you know how many Hamas you've killed, but you don't know how many civilians you've killed. And I'm just asking you why. Why is it you've kept a record of one, but not the other?
I personally don't have that information to give to you. You can ask me over and over. I'm not going to come up with more information. I don't personally
you don't know?
I don't have that information for you.
But you're an official government spokesman for the Israeli government, and you have no idea.
Piers, I came on here to focus on what's going on with the war.
Well, actually, you came on here to answer my questions, I think.
Yeah, and I don't have an answer for you for that.
And I didn't intend to press you on this point because I assumed that you would not respond the way you have. But I've never had an Israeli spokesman who simply said, I have no idea. Particularly after you boasted about the fact that you've been very smart in the way you've avoided killing civilians. How do you know?
By the way, Dream, I've got the cupcake.
Because
I've
I
taken
know
a bite
the
of
way
it.
in which the IDF operates. I know the way in which we go after the terrorists in the best possible way. It's not what I've said, it's what General Petraeus has said. It's what John Spencer from West Point has said. It's what multiple British generals have said. Israel goes out of its way to avoid civilian casualties. That's what we'll do. If you can point to me to another conflict by which they have evacuated, got out of harm's way civilians to the extent that...
My intent was to just be able to come on here and say we care very much about civilians. I didn't think you were going to get into specifics, you know? I mean, isn't it enough that we say it? Can't we just move on?
That Israel has done, then fine.
If you sorry, with respect, Mr. Hyman, how can you possibly expect me to accept any comparisons to any other conflict or war, given that you do not know how many civilians you've killed?
Piers, you understand that I can't prosecute the war over the media.
I'm just asking you for basic information. I'm not trying to trap you, and I'm not trying to unfairly harangue you. I think people are watching this and they'll make their own conclusions. I just find it astonishing that the moment I asked you how many Hamas you killed, you could tell me immediately. And the moment I ask you about civilians, you haven't got a clue, literally. That you're not even prepared to issue a ballpark number. And I think people will find that staggering, particularly given that you are insistent that you're doing everything you can to avoid killing civilians. To which, again, I just simply ask, how do you know? If you don't know how many you're killing, how can you possibly be sure that you are, A, doing better than other people waging war elsewhere, or B, that you have any idea how many you're killing? You don't, clearly.
The IDF monitors every single action that it takes. It weighs out the options.
It doesn't tell you, the official spokesman.
It avoids civilian casualties in the best possible way.
How do you know, Mr. Hyman?
Even if you were to take, please, if you're allowed...
Sorry, with respect, you come on here as the official Israeli government spokesman, and you don't want to be asked how many you've killed because you don't know, and yet you want us to draw comparisons to other conflicts in a positive way for Israel, and you want to tell me that IDF make a record.
I mean, the two options here are equally horrific. Sorry for interjecting if you're watching, but I do want to give some commentary. The two options are horrific. One is that they actually don't know. Let's contextualize this. The context is very specific and it's very troubling. You could even say horrific. They've bombed most of northern Gaza, as Piers has said. And while they were bombing, they told civilians to go to Rafah specifically. And they also bombed people on the way. They bombed civilian caravans as they were going there. And now that a bunch of people are corralled into Rafah as refugees, Israel is insisting on attacking Rafah. We saw one Israeli spokesperson say the purpose of attacking Rafah is to pressure Hamas into a peace deal. And then when Hamas offered a peace deal, Netanyahu and this guy right here that's being interviewed said, well, they're only offering a peace deal to stop our bombing of Rafah. So the point is to bomb Rafah. One option is they really don't know. And the other option is they do know, and they're just lying about it. They either don't care, or they do know and they don't want you to know. And they're deciding to withhold that number. My hunch is that it's actually the latter. They do know. They have a sense. And they don't want to say it. This guy's not authorized to say it.
Record of every single thing they're involved in, but they don't give it to you, the government spokesman, so that when I ask you, you have no idea. Do you understand how ridiculous that sounds? With respect.
With all due respect, I've told you that even if you were to use the Hamas figures, the ratio would still be better than any other army, and that's where the comparison can be done. However, we know above and beyond that the Hamas figures are not accurate. And we know from former conflicts that Hamas throws in anyone that's, someone could have passed away from a heart attack, someone could have...
so why is it that Israel actually after previous...
That's what they've done in the past.
Well, why is it after previous death tolls have been released by...
He sounds like someone from the tobacco industry, Yeah, somebody got cancer, but you don't know, it was the smoking that caused that, or, did they eat too many cupcakes? Yeah, a bunch of people died in the bombings, but we can't tell whether they had a heart attack or was the bomb that blew them up. You don't know. You need a doctor in there to examine every single corpse.
Hamas, through the Palestinian Health Authority, they've actually turned out to be ones that Israel has concurred with in the main. Can you not count either?
Piers, we're in the fog of war. We're fighting for our very existence.
No, you're not foggy when it comes to killing terrorists. You're only foggy, it seems to me, when it comes to...
I'm really tired of this "we're fighting for our very existence" line. That Israel's like the underdog, right? The Palestinian people have no defenders, true defenders. They're not a state. It's like a reservation. It's like a Native American reservation. It's an open air prison. There are militant groups like Hamas that have very rudimentary weapons that are 30 or 40 years old in terms of their technological development. They don't have armor. They don't have an air force. They don't have sophisticated telecommunications. They are absolutely in no way, shape, or form. And this goes back to the gaslighting that the state of Israel constantly does against the entire world, where they just have to pressure you to be someone who doesn't think at all and shames you and guilts you into that. It is absolutely beyond straining all credibility to in any way expect people to accept that Hamas is a threat to the existence of Israel itself. In no world does Hamas have the capability of dismantling the state of Israel. They're using 30, 40-year-old technology, no air force, no armor, operating from an open-air prison, hobbling together what capabilities they have, like operating out of tunnels. And Israel is one of the most advanced militaries that has ever existed on the face of the earth in the history of the human race. It is really like a worm fighting an eagle. Israel is not the underdog. And they can make arguments about their security or whatever else, and people can decide whether those arguments are good or bad. But the absurdity of talking about Israel's very existence being under threat, that this is an existential question, does other political work. Aside from being gaslighting and ridiculous, what it does is it creates a cognitive link to anyone who's sort of exposed to this, that a basic requirement of the existence of Israel is the genocide of the Palestinian people. So that when heard enough times and reinforced over and over and over again, the person who unskeptically takes this up would start to sort of equate needing to enact violence against the Palestinian people as a requirement of the existence of Israel. In other words, it authorizes genocide.
Killing civilians.
We're fighting against a terrorist organization that spent the last 16 years embedding itself underneath and within a civilian population. They're fighting from mosques, from hospitals, from UN facilities. I don't know if there's a comparison of any war in modern history in which a terrorist organization has embedded itself the way that Hamas has in Gaza. We are doing our very utmost to go after Hamas. And like I said, when the dust settles, you will see that.
Okay. Avi Hyman, the Israeli government spokesman, thank you very much. Well, I'm joined now by the pro-Palestine journalist and commentator, Abi Martin, and by Mosab Hasan, the son of Hamas's founder and former leader, author of a new book, From Hamas to America. Welcome back.
Well, it's also very convenient. It's a very well understood thing. Again, you could call it a state technology. It's a very old understanding. If you want to dominate a people, what you do is you target their systems of social reproduction, the mechanisms of a geography, the locations in a geography that sustain a population, essentially. Schools, hospitals, food supply, water. Because this eradicates the ability of the people to survive there. It's eliminating their basic resources of survival. So whether it's like the Spanish conquest, whether it's the US genocide of the Native Americans, whatever it is in whatever location, these are fundamental features of a conquest, of pre-settlement, genocide, domination, whatever you're going for, imperialism, colonialism, it's part and parcel. You eliminate whatever the mechanisms of social reproduction are. So while he's saying that no one's ever seen something like this, we could hypothetically grant him that. I don't, but we could say, okay, no group has ever done what Hamas has done. But certainly something that has been done over and over again, and that every statesman knows it comes with joining a state apparatus, is precisely how you dismantle a group of people. This is centuries old knowledge about how to run a state, right? And we've seen that before. Israel is now doing what other states have done by targeting the mechanisms of social reproduction, hospitals, schools, etc., etc., etc. It's also sort of interesting and fucked up and defeats sort of Israel's own premises. They say this is about getting the hostages back, and they're bombing hospitals because there are Hamas bases underneath it, and blowing up all the people in the hospital, killing the doctors and nurses, which isn't just like killing one person, it's also killing all the people that the doctors and nurses would later go on to help had they survived. So not only is this a question of what the bombing of hospitals produces, it multiplies the violence. You shut down the ability of people to receive care, you kill the care providers, and you kill patients, people that are there because they're sick, kill children, to get at a tunnel underneath the hospital that's allegedly there. How does Israel know that the hostages aren't there? How does Israel know that the hostages aren't there if this is about getting the hostages back? And it's not about clearing out the people of Palestine and removing the mechanisms of social reproduction, if it's not a genocide. And if they do know the hostages aren't there, why aren't they targeting the places where the hostages are? Why aren't they doing targeted rescue operations at the locations where the hostages are? Why are they bombing hospitals? Again, it's like gaslighting. Assume you're stupid, and they tell you these things hoping that you'll be stupid enough to just believe it.
To both of you, Avi Martin, I found that, I've got to say, a quite extraordinary interview. To be an official government spokesman and admit you have no idea how many civilians you've killed, whilst trying to simultaneously compare yourself favorably to other civilian death ratios in war, seemed to me staggering.
This guy over here won't blink at all. Look at him.
Indeed. I mean, especially since we have seen the comparison as the dust has been settling real time on our phones. We see Israel has committed, in fact, some of the most heinous war crimes in modern history, Piers. And as we're seeing the invasion now of Rafah, cutting off the last vestige of escape for Palestinians, the last vestige of aid delivery, 1.3 million Palestinians, including 600,000 children, with nowhere left to go. This is what Palestinians were told was a safe corridor. That is why they all fled to Rafah. Rafah has been bombarded for the last several weeks, killing dozens of people every day. So I think at this point, 6 months into a genocide, to be deliberating whether or not Israel should continue with this onslaught, this military operation that will result in mass slaughter to continue their ethnic cleansing of Gaza is frankly absurd, patently so, considering what we've seen them do just in the last several weeks, Piers. Evidence of summary executions of doctors, evidence of mass graves, hundreds of bodies bound, dozens of men, women, and children bound, evidence, according to the UN, of Palestinians buried alive, using drones to lure out Palestinians with sounds of crying children so they could be shot and killed. I mean, this is unparalleled in modern history, actually. And the devastation that's occurred in the Gaza Strip, according to the UN, will take 80 years to rebuild without conditions. So at this point, Israel needs to be stopped before they continue this horrific onslaught, Piers.
Mosab, I'll get you to respond to what Avi just said, but just your response to that interview with an Israeli government spokesman, because I got to say, I found that pretty stunning, that he would be so certain how many Hamas terrorists the IDF have killed, but admit he had no idea how many civilians have been killed, given that it's the deaths of the civilians that is getting Israel so much unpopular reaction around the world.
Because we cannot send Israelis to Rafah and to dangerous zones to collect statistics and count the numbers. It's a very dangerous zone. Israel is looking from the outside. And also, who said that Israel is only
Now, I never thought that the following words would ever come out of my mouth. But as Piers said, and I feel gross saying that, but as Piers Morgan said, if you can count the Hamas that you've killed, and you've got a figure on that, How did you get that figure and you're unable to get a figure on the civilians?
Responsible for the killing of Gazans, mostly Hamas responsible. First of all, for taking human shields. Second, their booby traps. How could you differentiate the death that it was caused by an airstrike or by a Hamas death trap?
I want to just be clear. The reason why Israel can get away with it is because the United States is on the UN Security Council, and the UN Security Council can veto UN intervention.
How do we know the difference?
Well, yeah, but
And
the
in
point I
war,
would make
people
though,
die.
Yeah, but
Listen, listen to me. All this moral, Piers, no, listen to me. All this dilemma, you know, you're going with your whatever morality. This is war.
Your whatever morality. Fuck this guy. You're watching children get blown up and you got your whatever morality. Oh, don't kill children. But this is war and we kill children in war. Okay, then don't do war. It's more of this circular logic. You shouldn't kill children. That's what they're mad about, is killing children. Killing children is bad, and that justifies war. And in war, you can kill children because war is war and we need war. They think we're just so stupid. We have to bomb Rafah to force Hamas into a peace deal. Hamas is offering a peace deal, but it's only to stop us from bombing Rafah. So therefore, we can't stop bombing Rafah. They think you're stupid.
In war, people die. You need to wake up to this reality, accept it. Stop this denial. We are in the face of savages who hijacked an entire society. This is a very difficult war. No other army can do the job, and I'm not willing to risk thousands of lives of foot soldiers to deal with this type of savages who hijacked the entire society. 100,000 people could have died. Israel is doing everything they could. Don't reduce it to the point, do you have statistics? Who cares?
Well, actually,
Egypt,
no, I think you're missing my point.
Authority,
Yeah, Mosab.
Jordan,
All right.
the Arab world don't want Hamas at whatever cost.
Mosab.
Whatever it costs, we want to remove Hamas from power.
Okay, I understand that. That's a different question. My point is why...
Do you?
Well, why does...
Well, thank you. That makes things very clear. I understand it, but of course, I find it morally appellant. It is genocidal, and it's inexcusable. But when people, you know that saying, when people tell you who they are, believe them? What came out of his mouth is, we want to remove Hamas at any cost. Any cost means any cost. It doesn't matter how many hospitals we're going to bomb, how many children have to die, how many civilians are going to die, because any cost is worth paying to get rid of Hamas. And it's very convenient when you're on the side of the people who have satellites and F-18s and advanced missile systems, tanks, bombs, a navy, air force, to look at people in an open-air prison, and a segment of them don't want to be in an open-air prison, to say, we've got to kill them at any cost. This guy's not going to pay the cost. At any cost to them is what he means. We will remove them at any cost to them. If the most effective way to remove Hamas was a more peaceful approach that risked possibly allowing them to continue until they lose legitimacy, that might risk Israeli lives, he's not actually willing to pay that cost. What he means is, we will pay any cost in Palestinian lives. We will kill any number of them in order to remove Hamas. And like I said, when people tell you who they are, believe them. When people tell you who they are, believe them. He just said they are going to remove Hamas at any cost. And what he's doing is getting angry, trying to shame other people into saying, yes, yes, yes. However many civilians you have to kill, however many cities you have to turn into rubble, however many hospitals you have to destroy, any cost is worth paying to get rid of Hamas. Let's say the cost of paying Hamas is that this guy has to go up to his children and shoot them in the face. And if he knows that somehow magically that will remove Hamas, do you think this guy would do that? Do you think he would go to his own children and shoot them in the face if that guaranteed that Hamas would be eliminated? Because he's willing to pay any cost. No. He just wants to go up to some other parent's children and shoot them in the face, and shoot those children in the face, and make those parents pay that cost.
My question is this for you. Why is it that, if, as you say, Israel has no way of working out who's being killed here, and I know all about war. My brother served in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. My brother-in-law served in wars. My grandfather served in wars. My uncle served in wars. I don't need a lecture about what warfare is, but I do find it surprising that Israel's official spokesman, months and months into this war, is able to tell me immediately how many Hamas terrorists have been killed by Israeli forces, but admits he hasn't got a clue how many civilians have been killed. And I'm sorry, I think most viewers, will find that stunning. You say Israel has no way of checking, but they seem to have a way of checking how many Hamas they're killing, Mosab.
He just also said because there's corpses all over the place. I'm sorry I keep pausing, but now he's switched it to the reason they don't know how many civilians are dead is because there's so many. Before it was, well, there's no way to go and count. You know, it's unsafe to do the counting. But then it's like, wait, well, as Piers said, again, it feels gross saying that, but as Piers said, if it's unsafe to do the counting, then how do you know how many Hamas you've killed? Because they have that number. Now he's saying they can't count because there's corpses all over the place. You know, how are we supposed to count all these corpses? It doesn't really sound like the earlier statement that this is the smallest ratio of civilian to combatant deaths of any modern army ever in a conflict, which is what they're literally saying. This is the best ratio of civilian to combatant deaths ever that's ever been achieved in any war.
Listen, it's Israel's responsibility to know the death of their own citizens. This is their responsibility. I think your question was absurd. This is why you put him on the spot. He was not prepared for it.
I didn't put him on the spot.
But this is not going to change the reality on the ground. The reality on the ground, Hamas must go. The only side want Hamas to stay is the Iranian Ayatollah, and for some stupid reason, Karen
and they've tried that,
wants Hamas to stay. But the Arab world, let me tell you something, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the majority of the Arab world, we are Arabs. I am Arab. We are not Palestinians. We don't want Hamas. We don't want Islam. We want Islamists out of power.
Okay.
It's as simple as that.
All right.
They have been killing Jewish and Arab children.
Right.
This is not your game. This is not her game. It's not about statistics.
It's not a game.
It's about doing the correct thing of removing Hamas from power.
Mosab,
end of the story.
Let me interrupt, because you quoted Saudi Arabia in your rant there. So let me read you a statement from the Saudi Foreign Ministry. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs expresses the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's warning of the dangers of the Israeli occupation forces targeting the city of Rafah as part of its systematic bloody campaign to storm all areas of Gaza Strip and displace its residents towards the unknown in light of a lack of safe zones after the massive destruction caused by the Israeli war machine. The ministry affirms the kingdom's categorical rejection of the occupation forces' continued blatant violations of international resolutions, calling for the cessation of these massacres and their violation of international law and international humanitarian law without deterrence, which exacerbates the humanitarian crisis and limits international peace efforts. The ministry renewed the kingdom's demand for the international community to intervene immediately to stop the genocide carried out by occupation forces against defenseless civilians in the occupied Palestinian territories. So when you say all Arabs agree with you, Mosab, actually they don't. That is the Saudi Foreign Ministry saying they want it to stop right now.
As we speak, the intelligence services of the Arab world, all of them in a joint operation room with Israel to rid of Hamas. I don't care about some politician trying to make a political statement. It's false. The reality on the ground, we don't want Hamas. We don't want Islamists. We don't want this anarchy, this revolution without a moral compass. We don't want to globalize it. We don't want to bring it to the United States.
Just to be clear, if you're just joining us, the same spokesperson a moment ago criticized everyone who would have any question about Israel's military operation for being too moralistic and worrying too much about children dying, and to stop being so moralistic. And now he's saying the opposite. And a moment ago he said that it's worth paying any cost any cost to get rid of Hamas. So however many hospitals you bomb, however many cities you destroy, however many Palestinians have to die, it's worth it to him. He's willing to pay that cost. Essentially, he's taking a position that it is not right to propose any restriction whatsoever on how many people you kill, how you kill them. There are no rules of war. You can do whatever you want to achieve your goal of getting rid of Hamas. Any cost. That was a direct quote.
The game is over. Hamas is out, and their death warranty has been issued. It's a finished job.
All right,
and we are going into Rafah, and we are going to eliminate every last one of them.
Okay, let me bring in Abby. Abby, you've been listening to this.
So this is the one thing I'll give this guy credit for. This guy's being, I think, a lot more honest and less gaslighting. It's still appellant and morally atrocious, but at least he's being more honest, because he's saying the point is to go in and kill. Israel tried to say, well, the point is to get peace, and then Hamas offered peace, and they said, well, they're only offering peace so that we don't bomb the city. He's saying, no, the point is to bomb the city. We'll pay any cost. We'll kill as many people as we have to kill. That's war, baby. If you don't like it, grow up, stop sucking on your pacifier, and enter the real world where we're going to kill babies all we want.
I mean, fundamentally, I understand why Israel and Israelis want to eliminate Hamas completely, because this is a terror group who are wedded to the eradication of Israel and everybody in it. In fact, they have reiterated publicly through their official spokesman a desire to commit as many October the 7th as they can. So I completely understand why Israel wants to get rid of these terrorists. The question is, how do they do that without killing many, many more civilians? And as we saw from the Saudi statement, there are many Arab countries now in the region increasingly concerned that if there is a full attack on Rafah, which has 1.5 million people, a lot of civilians are going to die.
Right, and you know, to your point before, I think the death toll is actually vastly undercounted, considering how we have not even began to excavate the bodies under the rubble. So I would say that the death toll is a vast undercount. As far as Mosab's point about Hamas, I think that, you know, Mosab is the Palestinian who hates Palestinians. He's developed a lucrative career being able to lie about basic facts about this conflict. And so when he says Palestinians or Hamas, what he really means is all Arabs and all Muslims. In fact, I've seen that plain as day in his social media and talks. He thinks that all Muslims are terrorists. And so, I mean, this is credited to the point that he is actually credited to jailing what is called the Mandela, the Palestinian Mandela. Marwan Barghouti. This is a guy who he put in prison 20 years ago, who was marching side by side with Israeli peace activists denouncing Hamas killing civilians. So again, I mean, when we're looking at someone who's worked for Israeli intelligence, who spouts the same rhetoric as Israelis, who say Hamas, but what they really mean is all Palestinians, I mean, it's really hard to debate someone on the fundamental reality and the principles of, you know, the facts of this conflict. Now, to your point, Piers, about what should they do about Hamas, I reject the premise of Israel's genocide. I'm not going to sit here and say, yes, Hamas is a terrorist organization and they need to be eradicated. Of course, that's not true. And I think that we can both agree.
What do you mean that's not
it's
true?
An impossible task. It's not true that something needs to be done about Hamas. I don't agree with that framework and the parameters of that debate.
Why?
Because Israel's been committing ethnic cleansing and genocidal policies against the Palestinians for 70
But Hamas
plus
literally
years.
has
and
a
as
charter.
I reiterated
but Abby,
before,
hang on. Hamas literally
But hold
has
on,
a
Piers.
stated charter of the elimination of Israel. That is the purest personification of a publicly stated policy of genocide
that's not
I can
true,
imagine.
Piers. That's not true. Their revised charter says that they actually recognize the existence of the Israeli state among 1967 borders. That's the revised charter, and they actually make a political differentiation between Zionism and Judaism.
So
That's
when
the
their
actual
official
charter of
spokesman,
Hamas.
so
So
when
you keep
Hamas
pointing
is,
to us, you keep pointing to a random spokesperson. Yeah.
Yeah, well, he's not a random. He's the official spokesman for Hamas. And he said literally 2 weeks after October the 7th, we are going to do this again and again and again. That is an existential genocidal threat to the existence of everyone in Israel. Clearly. Said publicly on camera. I mean, he's brazen about it.
Look, I think that when you're comparing one guy and his statement to literally
He's the official
dozens
spokesman,
of
Abby.
genocidal statements, Okay, but look at the official spokespeople of Israel, Piers, and look at the
just have
actual
one
genocide
on.
they're committing. You cannot compare the two. It's a complete false equivalency. One guy is saying one thing, the other dozens of Israeli ministers and cabinet officials and public media personas on TV are saying one thing and actually doing it on the ground.
You would allow Hamas to stay in power?
On the ground. It's not up to me, Piers. Hamas is
What's your
representative
opinion?
of a large sector.
You've been expressing many
okay,
opinions.
But here's the thing.
What's your opinion?
Marwan Barghouti is the most popular unifying figure in Palestinian society. He would resoundingly win in an election against Hamas. So what this is about, this isn't about Hamas. This is about eliminating every faction of Palestinian resistance, peaceful or not. It is not about Hamas.
It's all about what Hamas did on October the 7th.
But Piers, I think we both know it's not. Because what is the military occupation founded upon? When did Hamas come into power? We know that this isn't just about Hamas. What was Israel doing in the West Bank the year prior to October 7th? They killed 500 Palestinians, 80 children. This is ethnic cleansing. This is a military occupation. As long as you have these policies in place, you will never get to the root of the violence, Piers.
All right, Mosab, there was an allegation.
And that's where we see Piers being the Piers we know and love. Because that was extraordinary. I mean, Piers has asked some tough questions, and he's been skeptical of the answers of both guests, but that really was an extraordinarily egregious lapse of historical context, that Piers is acting as if this began on October 7th, that there isn't a decades-long occupation and a long history of egregious murder, violation of human rights in the open-air prisons that signify Palestinian territory. This is just sort of a new thing that was started by Hamas just now. And it was all sort of peaceful and normal before then, until the dirty Hamas arose.
Allegation there that you think all Muslims are terrorists. What's your response to what Avi Martin said?
Well, you know, this is Abi's desperate attempt to discredit me. I am a man of the field. I fought against Hamas as part of intelligence, legitimate intelligence organization, against savage group that were targeting civilians in suicide bombing attacks, waves of suicide bombing attacks that they killed people indiscriminately. So Abi today want me for some reason to apologize for saving human life, because my truth challenges her convenient truth. Abi does not have the authority. She's just a self-appointed low-grade journalist. How can you be a journalist and you call this a genocide, ethnic cleansing? And she just keep repeating ethnic cleansing, genocide, colonialism, etc. None of it is real, including Palestine. It's only in your head. None of it is existential.
What were we talking about before? Palestine isn't real. Here we go. She's using these terms like genocide that aren't real. And then he goes and does a speech act that constitutes intent to genocide and denies the existence of Palestine. Literally, this time it wasn't like 2 seconds later. It's the same sentence. We're just talking about denying that a people even exist is itself a genocidal act.
Palestine was never born. How can you free it? It was never there. It's just a colonial entity, and some people choose to make it into a national identity, and this parrot has been...
That's the origin of almost every people, particularly in the last, 300 years. An arbitrary colonial drawing of borders that people then have to live in, and as a product of them living in it, they form an identity around it. Because guess what? When you establish borders and rules and laws and make people live according to those things, they form an identity because they now have a shared experience. That's what's called subject formation. The process is really well studied. He's just describing how any group of people come to be, but he's acting like it's this unique aberration of Palestine that disqualifies them. How you took a bunch of peasants from Europe and you had an arbitrary colonial marking of territory, and those people became the American people. You had the Roman Empire put arbitrary borders around these tribes in Western Europe that were disconnected and established borders and rules. Within those borders and rules, they established an identity, and those people are called the people of France. That's how people come into being.
Just repeating Hamas propaganda. Marwan Barghouti that she's talking about him, she never met him. I knew Marwan before he got to power. He is a criminal. He killed 5 people. He has blood on his hands. He cheated on his wife. He has a secret son that he never revealed it to the public. Of course, I can criticize him, and I can criticize all the criminals that I know personally. She's been there only for a visit, and maybe she had some falafel sandwich, you know, and she really was blown away of the Palestinian experience. There is no such a thing as Palestine. It's about time to retire, find a different job. You're not a journalist. You don't qualify even to be a mother.
Wow. Abby.
He's really on the verge of slut-shaming her.
Mosab, you know, it's usually a public figure. If they were caught lying about half the things that they said, they would be completely discredited and never allowed airtime. You are spewing such ahistorical anti-Arab bigotry that not even the fringe of Israeli society would agree with you. I mean, not even Israeli historians agree.
I'm not anti-Arab. I am Arab. I am Arab. This is my ethnicity. Islam is just
anti-Muslim bigotry.
I am not a Muslim.
Mosab.
We are Arabs.
Mosab.
He keeps trying to say anti-Islamist, but he accidentally has said like 5 times anti-Islam. Just FYI. This guy's been incredibly honest. He literally said that the point of going into Rafah is to kill Hamas, and that it's worth it to kill them and pay any cost to do it. Any cost. Any amount of hospitals, any amount of civilians that die, you just kill them all. Any cost is worth it.
Okay. Then anti-Muslim bigotry, which is frankly appalling considering that there's 1 billion people on the planet who would be characterized as you as, you know, extremists who need to be used force against, according to you. But Mosab, not even Israeli historians would agree with the fact that you claim that there's no military occupation in the West Bank, that there's no apartheid state. Israelis at least admit, yes, those things exist, but here's why they're necessary and justified. They don't even agree with you. You're so fringe that I don't even know where you're coming from. I mean, so again, if we can't even agree with the basic facts of the conflict and the reality in front of our eyes, I don't know how we can really even discuss this.
What's that?
Yeah, because you don't qualify.
Well, I think the belittling her credentials. Listen, well, everyone's entitled to an opinion.
Piers.
This is the most authoritarian line, you know. This is like how you can see how deeply rooted the authoritarianism is. I am an official spokesperson. I have the authority of the state. I have a little badge, and you don't have a badge. Who are you? You're nobody. You're just self-appointed. You're just saying what you think, but I say what a state thinks, and what a state thinks is more correct. I have the authority of a state. You have nothing. You're nothing. Who are you? It's the most authoritarian thing. I've got a little badge. I've got a badge. Daddy State told me that as long as I say is what they want me to say, I get to have this little badge. Who are you? Where's your badge?
Listen, best case scenario, if there is an occupation, it's between Israel and Jordan, or it's between Israel and Egypt, because it was not an occupation of a country called Palestine. There was never Palestine in history. This is not an absurd statement. It's reality. Palestine never exists. There was not a country. It was not a nation. It's not an ethnic group. We are Arabs. We are the Arabs of Judea and Samaria. And when I was born, like millions of Palestinians, we had Jordanians.
Wait a second. I thought you just said there's no such thing as a Palestinian. So are you a Palestinian or not? There's no such thing as that. Where'd that word even come from? Was that made up yesterday?
Birth certificate. The people of Gaza were Egyptian with Egyptian birth certificate. There was no Palestine. Yasser Arafat created this entity, and everybody believed him. And this lie must die. This is why I don't like what Abby and her likes doing by trying to delegitimize Israel. She's trying to discredit me. Who gave you the authority? How dare you?
You are
I'm
a spy.
Son of that region.
You're
I'm
a spy for Israeli
conflict.
intelligence,
You
Mosab.
This guy said that colonialism doesn't exist, and then in the next sentence he said that Palestine only exists because colonialism drew some borders around it, and then from that people created an identity called Palestinian. So first of all, does colonialism exist or not? And the second thing is that's how identities form. You create a border around people and you subject them to rules, and then they create a culture and identity around the fact that they're all unified within those borders. So that's how, like, most groups of people come to exist. That's how a melting pot of European peasants became the Americans. That's how people, it's not the only way, but it's one of the main ways that people come to exist as a people.
It is not funny. It's not funny. Your tale,
It's
your
not
false
funny at
narrative
all.
need to
It's-
stop because
it's
you
not
are
funny at all,
creating chaos.
Mosab.
Listen, Abby, you are bringing
Mosab, you're
chaos to the
very-
United States and you will be held accountable. You are just a
Okay.
criminal like them.
Sure.
That's a
Okay,
threat.
Mosab, you can't be taken seriously, and you're not legitimate because you are literally, you have
I
worked
don't
for
care if
Israeli
you take me
intelligence to out
seriously
your
or
own
not.
people. But listen,
Sooner
okay, but
or
Mosab,
later
you
you
can't discredit
realize.
my reality as well. You can't discredit my reality as well. I was in the West Bank. I had assault rifles
Then
pointed
don't
at my head from a
dare you.
17-year-old
Don't dare you
American
try
from
to
Palo
discredit me.
Alto.
You
That's an occupation.
are in my domain
Mosab.
right
That's
now.
a military occupation.
Okay, you are in my domain. When you come to my domain, you have to pay respect. You have to respect all the effort that I put to save human lives, and you cannot reduce that into some propaganda because
why
it's
on
not.
earth would I
It's not
respect you
about
for
Israel.
putting
It's
the
about
leader of Fatah, Mosab? You put the most unifying, popular Palestinian figure. You are credited to putting him in prison. This is someone who would win an election against Hamas. He is a peace activist. He was fighting for a two-state solution. This isn't about Hamas, and you know it. This is about you shutting down, tamping down on all factions of Palestinian society. And let's be clear, what is Palestine supposed to do? What are Palestinians supposed to do when in 2018, thousands of Palestinians in Gaza marched peacefully to this fortified perimeter fence that Israeli snipers have authorized themselves
This
to
guy's
shoot, to
position
kill,
is you
and
can
that's
kill
exactly
as
what they
many
did.
people as
they
you want,
massacred over 200
and he wants
peaceful
people to
demonstrators.
be grateful for that.
Medics.
Just you
Press,
decide. You're the
journalists,
authority. You're
clearly
Judge
marked press,
Dredd. Kill
disabled
as many people
in
as you
wheelchairs,
want.
and children. These are all violations
Pay
of
any
international law
cost.
in the Geneva
And we
Convention.
have to thank you
Israeli
for it.
snipers perched up behind sand dunes picked people off one by one in a methodical slaughter over the course of several months. That's when Palestinians tried to peacefully protest. So I think the question should be, what should Palestinians do? Because they're not even allowed to advocate for their legal rights. They're not even allowed to raise up a Palestinian flag. I visited a place called Sebastia in the occupied West Bank, and Palestinians were shot and in the hospital for simply erecting a Palestinian flag on a hilltop several days prior. This is the brutal reality of military occupation in the West Bank, Mosab. I mean, I want the violence to end. I empathize with the victims of both sides of this. And that's why I want to get to the root of the conflict. Yes, I don't go out there and say Jews can't be trusted like you say about Muslims. I empathize with all civilian life. I believe and cherish the sanctity of human life. And that's why I want to get to the root of why violence occurs, Mosab. And
let me ask Mosab a question. Do you agree with the principle that Palestinians should be entitled to exactly the same human rights as Israelis?
Listen.
That should be an easy yes.
The suffering of the Arabians. Again, stop calling them Palestinians. They are not Palestinians. We are Arabs. We are the Arabs of Judea and Samaria. And Israel and the Jewish people have
Palestinians
no
call
problem
themselves
since the beginning of their state. Well, you gave them that name. You forced the international community and the rest of the world.
All right, well, let me rephrase the question.
Should
the people who live in Gaza and on the West Bank, should they be entitled to the same human rights as Israelis?
If they have equal responsibility as the decent citizens of the state of Israel, that includes Arabs, Jews, Christians, and all other citizens of the state of Israel.
You only have rights
yes,
if you're obeying.
They have equal rights. But if they are not taking their responsibility, if they are using violence, sending suicide bombers, and killing babies, kidnapping a 1-year-old, you know, how do you answer to the mother and to the mothers of the hostages and all those?
They're not talking about Hamas fighter kidnapping a 1-year-old. They're asking whether the civilians living in these cities have human rights. And his answer is, because somebody kidnapped a 1-year-old, you can bomb a city.
Those who got killed on October 7, you know, it's very easy to just try to delegitimize Israel This is what Abby and her likes have been trying to do for so long, but they don't have the moral power.
By this logic, if someone in Los Angeles kidnapped someone from Las Vegas could bomb Los Angeles. I mean, I hate to say this because I don't like Piers Morgan, but Piers asked the right question. Do the people have human rights? The people that are living in these cities, do they have human rights? And his answer, he's dancing around it, but his answer is no. His answer is, when a member of the population does something wrong, you can punish the whole population, up to the point of just mass slaughter.
To say what Hamas did, all the waves of suicide bombing attacks, October 7, that was a genocide. That was a genocide. So stop spreading the false narrative. Now, regarding to the Arabs who live there, they need a decent police force. They need a good economy. They need good education. And if they are able to integrate, then naturally could be a political entity based on their needs. But right now, when she say Palestine, who is? Islamic Jihad, Fatah, Marwan Barghouthi, Ismail Haniyeh, Hamas, Public Front. They are so conflicted. They don't have agenda. They don't have leadership. They don't have legitimacy. This is an anarchy that has been going on for about 70 years. And it's about time for it to stop. Now, to transform, to integrate the society, we must protect the children.
Your open-air prisons that you
number one before we talk
constantly
about
bomb and you
or whatever
shoot
name
people
you want to
for
give
putting
it,
up flags and you deny water. That inside there it's unstable is what you're saying? That's surprising.
Hijacking and using children as human shields, their own children, after killing Jewish children, then this is a capital crime. We cannot blind our eyes. We have to deal with priorities.
This guy's a monster.
First, we remove this savage group out of power. If Abi's intention were pro-peace, then this is our intention, that we should unify our efforts toward this main goal, first goal, priorities. Then after that, we can talk about the future. And this criminal you call Marwan Barghouthi in Israeli prison.
How are you supposed to differentiate who is and who is not Hamas when Israeli authorities have literally called almost every entity in Gazan society Hamas?
Well, they don't want
UNRWA.
assimilation because Israel's a
On
theocracy.
campuses Hamas. I mean, there's summary executions of doctors thrown in mass graves because they're called Hamas.
So even in what you're saying, Huck, I mean, to the extent there's assimilation, what you're talking about is at best a second-class citizenship status because Israel's a theocracy.
So I'm sorry that this label has been rendered completely meaningless. And as far as the term human shields, look, there's been no evidence, according to Amnesty International, during Cast-led and the 2014 onslaught and today. I mean, there is absolutely no evidence provided that Hamas uses human shields and that somehow justifies this heinous slaughter of predominantly women and children in Gaza. And even if they were literally standing behind hostages, you still can't just kill hundreds of people in a single airstrike because a Hamas commander is right there. And that's exactly what Israel is admittedly doing. Through AI, they're saying that they could kill up to 100 civilians for every Hamas official. It's absolutely outlandish.
But if a group like Hamas launches a terrorist attack on Israel that kills 1,200 people, they take over 200 more people hostage, including babies and Holocaust survivors, that is a declaration of war, which they knew would lead to the kind of response we've seen from Israel. And Israel...
But following this guy's logic, you couldn't possibly have a declaration of war because the Palestinians aren't a people and they're not a state. They're simply Arabs living within Israel. Essentially, they're in Israeli territory. So what you're talking about then, according to the logic of this, essentially what that means is the Palestinians are Israeli people. They're under the control of Israel in Israel's territory, and they're subject to Israeli law. And what you're saying is that a country has the right to bomb its own major cities. While the other Israeli spokespeople say the bombing's not indiscriminate, this guy actually says it is, and it's justified. Because you can pay, any cost is worth paying to get rid of Hamas. And the point is just to kill until they're all dead.
Israel would argue, and they would have some sound argument to that.
Again, it's the equivalent of saying, like, there's a bad group in Los Angeles, so we're going to bomb Los Angeles. We're going to use military force. The United States government says, in Los Angeles, there's a bunch of kidnappers, and so we're going to bomb downtown Los Angeles until all the kidnappers are dead, and it's worth it. However many people die, it's worth it.
This. If someone declares war...
That's not, just to be clear, I'm sorry, I keep starting. That's not a stretch. That's not me being hyperbolic. That's literally the logic of this guy's argument. That is a direct analogy. If you put together all of the things he said, it's that this is an internal civilian population, which means essentially what's at stake is they violated the law of the state that they live in. And in response to that, you can bomb cities. I mean, I can tell you how many UN conventions that violates. But
on you in that manner, and you respond, and in eliminating the terrorists who committed that heinous crime, civilian casualties are incurred, they would say that that is exactly what has happened in any other war in history. That the principle is the same, that the civilian loss of life is appalling, but that the principle of retaliating against a body of people who have committed one of the worst terror attacks in living memory, that is why they're doing it.
Piers, there's no symmetry between the two sides. It's complete asymmetrical mass slaughter of women and kids. You know that.
Well,
and
actually,
you could also
Hamas
make the
did
same
commit a
argument
mass
for what
slaughter
preempted.
of women and kids. They did.
But,
you say there's no symmetry.
Piers,
there's an absolute symmetry.
But there's no symmetry. There's no symmetry between an occupying, colonizing force and the people that they're occupying and colonizing. You could obviously make the same argument that preempted October 7th, that it was a declaration of war to siege Gaza, to prevent aid from getting in.
I'm sorry, I just want to weigh in. The positions of the spokesperson are extraordinarily analogous to the positions. I mean, very analogous. Not a stretch, not a metaphor. They're like the same as justifications for the genocide of the Native Americans. This guy said because the Palestinians didn't have a state before Israel established itself. They didn't have a state with a formal government. Essentially, they're not real. They're not a real people. They don't exist. And the point of saying that is that means that someone else can just move in and kill them, push them out of their homes, deny them water, destroy their crops, eliminate their food supply, bomb their hospitals. So back in 1948, all that was justified. You can just kill them all because they didn't have a government yet. And that means it's just open territory. And in the colonization of the Native Americans, there was a concept called terra nullius, which argued very directly that if people didn't have an established sort of state in the European sense, that you could just take their land and kill them. You could push them out of their homes. And that's essentially what this guy's saying. He's not denying that Palestinians didn't always live there. He's not denying that. Of course they lived there. That's why they had to be removed. There were people there. There were cities there. There were towns and villages and settlements. But they didn't have a formal state. He's not denying that there are always people there. He's just saying, well, they didn't have a government. So because they didn't have a government, you're allowed to just kill them. You're not a real people unless you have a government. And you have no rights unless you have a government. And you're allowed to just be slaughtered unless you have a government. And if you fight back against it, you deserve to be killed. It's genocide. He couldn't make it more clear and more direct.
To shoot people that stray too far out, that are fishing, that can't go get medical aid and are sentenced to death within Gaza. Is that not a declaration of war? Is it not a declaration of war to violate international law, to maintain a brutal fascist military dictatorship in the West Bank? These all preempted October 7th. So it just keeps going back and back to what is the root of actual violence, Piers.
Okay, Mosab, I'll give the last word to you. Where do we get peace from all this hell?
Hey, Loss, good to see you, by the way.
Naturally, if the Israeli protocol is not sufficient and it's not satisfactory to the expectations of Avi and many of her friends, then I say, how about we punish Hamas by their own laws, by the Islamic law? Why don't we follow the Islamic protocol? In this case, the Islamic law says, behead all men and take all women and children as booty. This is their moral stand. So she say it's
Okay,
asymmetric.
I'm sorry, this guy's so comical, and we spent a lot of time deconstructing him. I know this is really inappropriate, but I just had this desire to have my ringtone on my phone just be him saying, booty, the way he said it. Let's listen to that again. We deserve a little comedic break after hearing this guy justify genocide. His voice gets all high when he says booty. It's really funny to me.
And children as booty. This is their moral stand. So she say it's asymmetric. Well, we already know that. It's a very dirty war. We are dealing with people with the mentality of the 7th century tribalism. It's not an easy mission for a democracy, for any country, for any modern army, for any civilized society to deal with this. So we need to be reasonable. I understand if people are anti-war and they are pro-children, pro-life, me too. But sometimes we have to make very difficult choices. And Israel was really pushed to the corner. Israel is fighting for its very existence. I am fighting for my very existence. I did not kill any Arab. I did not kill any of their tribesmen. But they want me to cease to exist. Why? Because I criticize their religion. I criticize their stupid ideas that are leading towards global chaos. And instead of spreading the narrative, the victim narrative, what we need to do actually, we need to localize it, not globalize it. And we need to be reasonable of our expectations from a democracy in the middle of crisis.
Okay. Mosab Hasan Youssef, Avi Martin, it was a spirited debate. I think I learned, as I always do from these debates, I learned a little bit more than I knew before. So I thank you both very much indeed.
Wow, what a crazy ride. Let's debrief from that a little bit and decompress. And I'm just blown away by how transparent the logic is, even from the Israeli spokespeople. We first watched ministers say, or spokespeople who are saying, we're going into Rafah to pressure Hamas into a peace deal. And then Hamas offers a peace deal. And they say, well, they're only offering a peace deal so that we don't bomb Rafah. Obviously, that's Looney Tunes. That's just absolutely insulting level of gaslighting to the viewer. And then this guy comes on and says, actually, no, the point is just to do a lot of killing. By any means necessary. Kill however, whatever high cost you have to pay to do the killing. You gotta just kill everyone. Yeah. And when he was asked whether civilians have human rights, he couldn't answer the question. In fact, he went on a long, convoluted explanation for why you can kill them all you want. And when he was pressed with like, well, what if, you had to kill 100 civilians to kill one Hamas fighter? He didn't distance himself from that either. He didn't exactly say, yes, you could, but he didn't disclaim that. And he was there to justify the assault on Rafah, so. Tense, depressing. I hope as many Palestinians as possible make it through the night, make it through the day. Yeah, then he denied that the Palestinians were a people. And then he said because there was kidnappings, you're allowed to bomb cities. So, he's trying to have it both ways, every which way that he can, contradictory argument after contradictory argument, that all amount to you can kill as many civilians as you want. And in fact, if you question the killing of civilians, you are a terrorist yourself. And you have no right to question the killing of civilians. And by the way, the civilians don't really exist and they're not a people and they don't deserve to be a people and you shouldn't refer to them as a people. So couldn't it be more clear how genocidal the logic is? And, they're saying it with their own voices. It's not a hot take. It's coming right out of their own mouth. But I'm really curious what you all think, or sort of where you might want to take the conversation next. I think there's a lot of reasons. That's really a good question. I think there's very immediate material reasons, and I also think there's sort of deeper reasons. I think you have a complex set of overlapping interests. So one of the things I don't like that I do think sometimes gets tainted with anti-Semitism is this idea that Israel calls the shots for the USA. I don't think it's necessarily anti-Semitic, but it can become anti-Semitic. And I want to be clear that that's not accurate in terms of political reality. And there is this danger of this sort of like Jewish conspiracy type thinking. The USA is the big dog. They're not beholden to Israel. The United States is the sole global superpower. And it supports Israel because it's in the interests of important, powerful segments of the United States elite class to support Israel. The most immediate sort of thing for why the US supports Israel in this way is Israel buys our guns. We sell a lot of arms to Israel. Israel's one of the biggest customers for US arms manufacturers. So even when the United States gifts Israel weapons, tanks, and bombs and stuff, the United States is paying money to the arms manufacturers to produce those weapons. And that means that the relationship with Israel is quite lucrative for weapons and aerospace. Those are very important sectors of industry that are very powerful in US politics. So that's the most immediate thing. Broader military industrial complex also has other interests in Israel. The United States really fucked up with Iran in the 20th century. This is a very crude telling, but it matters in the case of Israel. Iran in the mid-20th century had kind of a democratic socialist, fairly pro-US, and as Iran developed in the post-World War II years, the Iranian regime was leaning towards a democratic socialist, like Western European style government. And part of that was it wanted to renegotiate and nationalize its oil interests, and the United States didn't like that. So the United States helped organize a coup which put in a Shah, and the Shah was a brutal right-wing dictator. And because once the Shah was in power, the Shah, which was by the CIA operation to put him in power, he suppressed and eliminated, and that meant the only sort of remaining force to resist the fascism of the Shah was the religious right. And that led to the Iranian Revolution and the rule of the Ayatollahs, where the right-wing religious fringe took control of Iranian society. And as a result of that, built into Iranian political culture is a deep mistrust and hostility towards the United States and United States meddling in Middle Eastern politics. And Iran has a lot of oil reserves, which also means that Iran is a competitor in the markets in the Middle East. So it's a hostile competitor with enough power and enough weight to kind of control or influence Middle Eastern politics, which the US is very interested in because of the oil. So another reason the US supports Israel is you could almost see it as like airstrip Israel. If Israel is there and the United States has a friendly state that's militarily powerful right near Iran with a very sophisticated military, it also gives the United States broader flexibility in the US entanglements in various countries in the Middle East. Military access is one of the main reasons why the United States supports Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is arguably the worst violator of human rights. The United States supports Saudi Arabia not only for the oil, but also because of the military flexibility it gives the United States to influence the Middle East. It's a little crude, but the outlines of a more academic answer that's a little bit more substantial than like Israel tells the United States what to do. The United States can't exactly dictate Israeli policy, but Israel is completely dependent on the United States, or not completely, but extraordinarily dependent on the United States. And the United States is actually not that dependent on Israel. It just likes money and it likes strategic flexibility in Middle Eastern politics. But beyond that, beyond those reasons for US support of Israel, which are very important from the perspective of US corporations, the military industrial complex, and the state's interest in strategic flexibility in a region that has the most important resource for a modern state, which is oil. Beyond that, there's also the fact that Israel's a settler colonial state. And to take the sides against settler colonialism would implicate the US in its own sort of guilt and crimes. Because in order to oppose Israel, you have to accept some premises that are very troubling in terms of US guilt complexes, broader political consciousness, and the way the United States culture has adapted to its own very dark history. And the premises you have to accept to oppose Israel is that just because a people didn't have a formal European-style government doesn't mean that you're allowed to just dispossess them of their homes and kill them and capture them inside borders that you newly create around them. And if you're not allowed to do that, and if you have to give the people their land back, what does that mean for the United States? Because in the case of Israel, though it's more recent than what the United States did to the Native Americans, there's still people alive when this first happened in 1948. If you accept the premises that you can't do that, and that you have to give people some of their land back, and you have to give them their own country, not under your control, not like a reservation, not like an open-air prison, but that it's wrong to do that. You cannot colonize people in that way. You can't just put a border up around them and say you belong to us now, and if you don't like it, leave, and then kill them if you want. If the United States accepts that argumentation and takes a stand against Israeli settler colonialism, then it would raise questions in the US about its own conduct. What would that mean for US territory right now? How could the US take the position that you have to give the people the land back? You'd have to say something like, well, after a certain time period, you don't have to give it back. So maybe because in the United States, it's just the great-grandchildren and the great-great-grandchildren of the people who lost their land, which, by the way, isn't that long ago. Because it's that far back, it's okay now. But in the case of Israel, it's too recent, so not enough time has passed. And I think that's too much cognitive dissonance. The US supported South Africa, right? It supported apartheid when the vast majority of the rest of the world was opposed to South African apartheid. And the reason the United States supported South African apartheid was really clear. And the apartheid system in South Africa was one of the worst ever devised anywhere, including in ancient history. It was a exceptionally brutal apartheid system. But the United States couldn't take a stance against apartheid because the United States has Jim Crow, or had Jim Crow. So the United States couldn't say, you can't create a dual citizenship status around black people and justify extreme police brutality, glass ceilings that limit upward mobility, disproportionate education. The United States wasn't in a position where it could do that. The United States actually was in a position where they needed to defend their own political economy. If the United States had taken a stance against South Africa, it would undermine the United States political economy, because the United States political economy was dependent and reliant on and functioned as an apartheid political economy. Beyond the military-industrial complex reasons, the United States has to support Israel, arguably, because if the United States took a position against Israel, it would require the United States to give things up internally. It would raise questions in the United States about how the United States functions. So, because the United States is unwilling to do that, I mean, again, the reason why the United States would be unwilling to do that is it's not an accident that the United States developed into an apartheid system with Jim Crow, starting as a slave system. That was all intentional. They created the laws that made that happen. So there's a way in which defending Israel and defending South Africa are also self-defense for the United States. And exactly, Dream, an empire frontier. Yeah. So I don't know. I hope that was a useful answer, but that's sort of how I see it. There's the material reasons, and then there's the political cultural reasons. Okay, Thrillbots, glad to see you are participating. Thank you so much again for the follow. Thrillbot says, I asked my Indian friend what he thinks about Israel and Palestine conflict. He told me everything happens for a reason: Islamic invasion, genocide, rape and enslave Hindus from Iran to India for over 800 years and never apologized for it. And what's happening in Gaza is due to the cumulative karma accumulated by Islam over the years, and they're paying for it now. I don't know. I'm not going to make a statement about like karmic values or generalization about the people of India. I have a lot of Indian friends, both Indian American and like Indians from India, born India. My experience isn't that people say things like that. But the logic of that particular person's viewpoint is, in my opinion, pretty atrocious and terrible. That is the logic, of course, that justified the untouchable class. To the extent I've seen people use logic like that, it usually comes from fairly privileged people. And so the idea of the sort of caste system in India sometimes is justified on the grounds that those people who are treated poorly and living subjected to the worst conditions, it's a karmic retribution for crimes of their past lives. And it's pretty appalling that logic almost always operates to justify inequality and violence. And I find it morally appellant, atrocious, horrific, disdainful that a human being could watch a city being bombed, and what they do is they think of why they deserve it, instead of being concerned for the people inside the city, or concerned for a world in which such a thing is possible, for a city to be bombed at all. It's disgusting to me, honestly. To be more specific, I find the statement of the person to be disgusting, because Iranians did something bad to Indians a long time ago. The people of Palestine deserve to be bombed in 2024 by Israel. It really just sounds like somebody likes watching death and they're just contorting. We're talking about this sort of death cult impulse, like the people out there that I think deep inside them actually just long to watch violence. They have some sort of resentment, and so they play that out in enjoying violence against other people. So that seems like quite an incredible contortion and stretch. You know, back in, there's another country, and then because that, and then they didn't apologize, and that's why now you can just kill Palestinians because they deserve it. Well, friends, I want to thank you again for supporting the stream. If you're lurking and you've enjoyed following along, you know, you can lurk as long as you want, but please remember to follow if you want to stay updated on when we're online or offline. I'm Void Corporeal, part-time college professor, full-time loser. I look forward to a fun Friday and more discussion with you all. Bye-bye.